I went to a painting shop to choose a small gift for my exhausted daughter, hoping it would bring her a little joy. While I was paying, the shop owner suddenly grabbed my hand tightly, his eyes full of warning. "Your son-in-law is not what you think. He's about to come here, hide quickly, and you'll know everything." He hurriedly pulled me to hide behind a huge canvas in a dark corner. 10 minutes later, my son-in-law walked in. Through the gap, I trembled as I heard him laughing mockingly about a plan. And what I heard next made my blood boil. Welcome to the channel. I'm so glad you're joining me for this journey. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Please keep in mind that certain creative elements have been added for storytelling. It's the underlying message that truly matters. The $82, three $20 bills, two tens and two singles lay on my scarred kitchen table like a mocking testament to 40 years of structural engineering. Yet it was the weight of a stranger's hand on my forearm that truly paralyzed me. I am Howard Palmer, a 69-year-old retired aerospace bridge inspector, currently living in a small apartment in Maplewood, where the silence of my late wife's absence is usually the only thing I have to manage. Every month I perform this same hollow ritual, smoothing out the wrinkled bills and counting the coins until the numbers match the digital deposit of my pension. It is a meticulous habit born of necessity, a way to ensure that the cables of my modest life remain under the proper tension. I live simply keeping my expenses low so that I can occasionally offer a small financial cushion to the only light left in my world, my daughter Emily. She is a pediatric oncology nurse, a job that requires the kind of emotional load-bearing capacity that would snap a lesser person. And lately when she visits, she looks as though her own foundations are beginning to crumble. She is thin, her eyes are permanently shadowed, and her smiles have become performative. Brittle things that I suspect are held together with nothing more than sheer willpower and love for a husband who, by her own accounts, is struggling just as hard as she is. I looked at my wife's photo on the mantel, the silver frame catching the afternoon sun. I whispered to her, promising that I would make Emily smile today, even if it cost me my last 20. Have you ever felt the precise moment a foundation begins to give way beneath your feet? It usually happens in the total silence, a microscopic fracture that eventually invites the entire structure to surrender to gravity. I decided then that I wouldn't go to the family dinner empty-handed. I would buy her that coastal painting I had seen in the window of Green's Fine Art Gallery. It was a modest piece priced at $52, but the blue of the water reminded me of the summers we spent at the shore before the world got so heavy. I dressed with care, choosing my old wool blazer and ensuring the $82 were tucked safely into my wallet. The walk to the gallery was brisk, the January air biting at my cheeks, but my mind was occupied with the engineering of the evening ahead. I needed to be the steady pylon for Emily, the one part of her life that didn't require her to provide care or sacrifice. Green's Fine Art Gallery was a sanctuary of hushed, expensive air and the rich, complex smell of turpentine and expensive varnish. Walter Green, the 67-year-old owner of Green's Fine Art Gallery, adjusted his spectacles and looked at me with an intensity that made the modest painting in my hands feel like a piece of evidence. He was a man with a heavy knowing sadness in his eyes, the kind of look usually reserved for those who have spent too long inspecting the damage after a storm. I approached the counter, the small canvas tucked under my arm, and offered him a polite smile. I told the owner that it was for my daughter, explaining that she needed to see something beautiful after the back-to-back shifts she had been pulling at the hospital. Walter didn't smile back. Instead, he watched my hands as I opened my wallet, his gaze lingering on the wrinkled $10 bills I was carefully extracting. Then the air in the gallery turned to ice. Without a word of greeting, he reached across the mahogany counter and gripped my arm, his fingers surprisingly strong for a man of his years. The physical intrusion was so sudden, so contrary to the gallery's refined atmosphere, that I felt the bitter tang of sudden fear on my tongue. He didn't let go. Instead, he leaned in until I could see the fine mesh of broken capillaries in his cheeks and smell the faint, sharp scent of peppermint on his breath. He whispered my name, Howard Palmer, and asked if I was indeed the father of Emily Redmond. When I confirmed with a hesitant nod, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to a raw, jagged empathy. He pulled a heavy leather-bound folder from beneath the desk and flipped it open, revealing a stack of high-value invoices. Each one was paid in full, and each one bore the name of my son-in-law, Marcus Redmond. My heart began to drum a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs as I looked at the numbers. $3,000 for a landscape, $2,900 for a modern abstract, all paid in cash. Walter Green leaned in his voice a low, urgent rasp that cut through the silence of the gallery. He told me that he wouldn't usually do this, that it was a violation of every professional code he held dear, but that his own mother had gone through a similar situation. He told me he had watched her lose everything to a man who looked exactly like my son-in-law, a man who built a kingdom of luxury on a foundation of stolen trust. His words were like a blowtorch to a suspension cable, quick, hot, and irreversible. I stared at the invoices, my mind racing to reconcile the image of the Marcus I knew, the one who complained about the cost of gas and his father's medical bills, with the man who was dropping thousands of dollars on oil. Paintings in the middle of a Saturday afternoon. Walter Green explained that Marcus came in regularly, always in the same high-performance car, always dressed in suits that cost more than my entire year's pension. He told me that Marcus often used an account name that made my stomach turn. Emily Palmer, my daughter's maiden name. The implication hit me with the force of a structural collapse. He wasn't just spending money. He was operating under a ghost identity, using the name she had before she ever met him. Walter Green checked his watch, his grip on my arm tightening even further, his eyes locked onto mine with a desperate urgency. He told me that Marcus would be here in exactly 15 minutes to pick up a $3,000 landscape he had commissioned. He asked me if I was ready to see the man my daughter was really married to, and as I looked at the $82 still sitting on the counter, I realized that the bridge of my life had just suffered a catastrophic failure. I pressed my back against the cold, rough brick of the storage alcove, the scent of linseed oil suddenly thick enough to choke on as the low hum of a precision-tuned engine vibrated through the gallery floor. Walter Green didn't hesitate. He moved with a frantic, quiet efficiency that suggested he had performed this kind of shielding before. He shoveled aside a stack of empty frames and gestured me behind a massive unfinished landscape canvas that leaned heavily against the wall. The rough weave of the fabric brushed against my face, smelling of dust and old oil paint, as I settled into the narrow shadow. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic percussion that seemed loud enough to alert the entire street. I felt a surge of hot humiliation prickling at my skin. Spied on a bridge as an inspector to find the rot in the steel, but I had never imagined I would be reduced to spying on my own kin in the dark corner of an art shop. Walter leaned close, his face pale and tight in the dim light. He whispered for me to keep my breathing shallow, warning me that the man approaching had the eyes of a hawk. I knotted my throat tight with a metallic, heavy taste of bile that I couldn't swallow away. Then the electric purr stopped. Silence is a terrifying sound when you're hiding. It stretched out thick and heavy until the chime of the front door cut through it like a blade. I peered through a sliver of space between the canvas edge and the brick wall, my vision narrowing as a gleaming cherry-red Tesla pulled into the curb with electric silence. The sun reflected off the hood in a blinding flash, a sharp contrast to the dingy shadows where I crouched. Marcus Redmond, 34, stepped out of the Tesla with the practiced oily grace of a man who owned the pavement. He stood on his Armani suit, catching the afternoon sun like a second. More expensive skin. I barely recognized him. This wasn't the man who sat at my kitchen table last Sunday wearing a faded sweater and complaining that the rising cost of eggs was putting a strain on their budget. This Marcus stood tall, his shoulders back, exuding an aura of immense casual wealth that made my stomach turn. He walked into the gallery with his head held high, the bell announcing his arrival like a fanfare for a king. His voice boomed as he entered, rich and devoid of the hesitant stutter he used at Sunday dinners. He called out to Walter, declaring the latest acquisition a masterpiece before he had even crossed the floor. Through my tiny vantage point, I watched him approach the counter. He moved with a terrifying confidence, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's focus. He didn't see me, but I saw every detail of his betrayal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slim, expensive-looking phone, tapping at the screen with fingers that I knew should have been stained with the grime of a hard day's work. How many years of overtime at the hospital does it take to buy one roll of those hundreds? The question burned in my mind as Marcus leaned against the mahogany desk, laughing at something Walter said. He looked so comfortable, so at home in this world of luxury, while my daughter was likely skip-counting pennies for groceries or wearing her shoes until the soles wore thin. Marcus began to flirt with the idea of buying even more, gesturing toward the back seat of the Tesla, where I could see Nordstrom bags and a distinct blue Tiffany box. He laughed a sound that felt like a physical blow to my chest, and told Walter that he was planning a surprise trip for his anniversary. He mentioned a week in Amalfi, a destination Emily had told me only months ago she could never afford to visit even in her dreams. The realization hit me with the weight of a falling girder. He wasn't just spending money, he was living a completely separate life, using her very identity to book high-end travel and luxury goods while she remained trapped in the reality of their supposed poverty. He pulled a thick roll of $100 bills from his pocket, the snap of the paper crisp and loud in the quiet gallery. He counted them out with a terrifying indifference, paying $3,000 for the landscape as if he were buying a pack of gum. I watched him pull out his phone again, this time taking a call. He spoke about a big score and a final phase, his tone clinical and detached. "My wife thinks I'm at the office filling out escrow papers," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Let her keep the dream right." The air in my lungs felt like lead. Watching him was like watching a termite feast on the rafters of my own home, efficient, silent, and devastating. He was hollow out the life I had helped Emily build one lie at a time, and he was enjoying the process. Every laugh, every casual flick of a $100 bill was a testament to the structural failure of the man I had trusted with my daughter's heart. He gathered his purchases, nodding to Walter with a smug satisfaction, and turned to leave. The bell chimed again, and the Tesla hummed back to life, the red blur of its taillights vanishing down the street. I stepped out from behind the canvas, my legs trembling so violently I had to lean against the wall for support. Walter Green didn't say a word. He walked over to the desk and picked up a heavy ledger, his hands shaking almost as much as mine. He didn't just hand me a single invoice, he pushed the entire book toward me. He pointed to a section showing a private holding company, registered to a dead relative of Marcus's, a shell used to funnel Emily's nursing salary away from their joint accounts. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the sharp vibration feeling like an electric shock against my thigh. I pulled it out my fingers, fumbling with the screen. It was a text from Emily. "Hey, Dad. Marcus is finishing up a long shift. We'll be at your place in 10 to pick you up for dinner." I stared at the message, the lies of the man I had just seen, clashing violently with the exhausted love in my daughter's words. I folded the gallery invoices into a tight, jagged square and shoved them into my pocket, feeling the paper bite into my palm, a physical reminder that the man my daughter loved was a ghost I had only just started to haunt. I walked out of the gallery with a gait that felt heavy each step on the pavement, vibrating through my joints like a warning of structural fatigue. The familiar rattling cough of an old Honda Civic signaled my daughter's arrival, the engine struggling, as if it too were exhausted by the life it was forced to lead. My daughter, Emily Palmer, a 32-year-old pediatric oncology nurse, arrived at my curb with dark circles under her eyes that told me she was working shifts for 2 people, even though she only has one body. I saw her thin face through the glass, framed by the mess of the car's interior, a graveyard of empty coffee cups and discarded hospital schedules. As I slid into the passenger seat, the smell of stale hospital air and antiseptic hit me a sharp clinical contrast to the expensive linseed oil and luxury I had just witnessed. I looked at her fraying sweater sleeves where she gripped the steering wheel, and a knot of agonizing pity tightened in my chest. "Sorry I am late, Dad," she said, giving me a weary smile that didn't reach her eyes. I had to wait for Marcus to finish a conference call with a potential client. "It is fine, Emily," I replied, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. I was just admiring the art. I kept my hand in my pocket, the sharp edge of the invoices cutting into my skin, anchoring me to the reality she didn't know existed. We pulled away from the curb, the Honda's worn-out engine humming a low, desperate tune. I watched the houses of Maplewood blur past, feeling the weight of the silence between us. How do you tell your child that the person they sleep next to is a stranger wearing the face of a hero? I looked at Emily, wanting to scream the truth. But years of engineering had taught me that you don't dismantle a load-bearing wall without checking the roof first. Instead, I listened. I listened as she spent the 45-minute drive to Princeton, building a monument of excuses for the man who was currently bleeding her dry. She spoke of Marcus's real estate firm, how the market was slow, and how he was spending his nights helping his father, Daniel, navigate the bureaucracy of experimental heart medications. She praised his dedication, her voice full of a tragic, misplaced pride. "Marcus is so stressed, Dad," she whispered, shifting gears with a hand that looked far too fragile for the work she did. "He is trying to save his father while the business struggles. I do not know how he does it." I stared out the window, my reflection in the glass, looking older and angrier than I felt. "I am starting to wonder that myself, honey," I said, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. I almost choked on the words. Almost. The sheer scale of the gaslighting was breathtaking. I thought of the red Tesla and the Armani suit, the casual way Marcus had flipped through $100 bills, while Emily likely skipped lunch to save for the gas in this rattling car. The betrayal felt like a rhythmic pounding in my skull. Every story she told about their financial struggle was a rehearsed script, a layer of paint applied to hide the rot beneath. She mentioned that they'd had to cut back on everything just to keep Daniel's medical bills current. Then she let it slip the blow that almost made me break my silence right there on the turnpike. She told me she had taken a second mortgage on her small condo, the one my late wife had worked 3 jobs to leave her just to help cover Daniel's latest treatment. I felt my stomach drop. That money didn't go to a heart specialist. It went to a leather interior and a chrome grille. It went to a velvet box from Tiffany's. I gripped the door handle until my knuckles turned white, the anger simmering into a steely tactical focus. Marcus wasn't just a spender, he was a parasite, and he had found the perfect host in my daughter's kindness. As we crossed into the affluent outskirts of Princeton, the scenery changed to manicured lawns and towering oaks. But our destination was a carefully crafted anomaly. We pulled into the driveway of the Redmond estate, and I felt a fresh wave of disgust. The house sat there like a hollowed-out tree, rotten at the core, but still standing by some miracle of deception. I observed the performative modesty of the place, the peeling gray paint on the porch, the unkempt hedges, the shutters that hung slightly askew. It was a costume. To the world, it looked like the home of a family clinging to the middle class by their fingernails. To me, after what I had seen at the gallery, it looked like a stage set. "It is not as nice as it used to be," Emily whispered as she killed the engine, the Honda giving one last shivering rattle before falling silent. "But they are doing their best." I looked at the peeling paint and felt the jagged square of paper in my pocket. "It is a convincing look," I said, stepping out of the car. My eyes were already scanning the perimeter, searching for the structural weaknesses in their lie. I noticed the way the dirt was fresh in one corner of the driveway, as if something heavy had been parked there recently. As we walked toward the porch, I saw an old rusted Camry parked in the shadows of the garage where the red Tesla should have been. It was the final confirmation I didn't need, but received anyway, a secondary vehicle for the Poverty Act. The house felt oppressive, a den of lions disguised as a sanctuary. The front door creaked open, and there he stood, Marcus Redmond, the man I'd just seen in a $2,000 suit, now wearing a stained t-shirt, and an expression of such weary, fake exhaustion that I felt a physical urge to strike him. He rubbed his eyes and leaned against the doorframe, his voice dropping an octave into his struggling persona. "Howard, Emily, thank you for coming," he groaned. "It has been a long day." I looked at the stain on his shirt, knowing it was as calculated as the Armani, and realized the dinner wasn't a social call. It was an inspection. As I crossed the threshold of the Redmond house, the air felt thick with a calculated dampness, as if the very walls had been coached to sweat with the effort of pretending to be broke. The front door had creaked open to reveal Marcus Redmond, in a costume that was an insult to every blue-collar worker I'd ever inspected bridges with. He stood there in a stained polo shirt and frayed jeans, his hair tousled just enough to suggest a day of hard labor that I knew for a fact he hadn't performed. I watched him closely, my eyes scanning him, with the clinical precision of a structural engineer looking for a stress fracture. The man I had seen an hour ago in a $2,000 suit was gone, replaced by this hollowed-out caricature of poverty. He groaned as he moved his hand, reaching for his lower back in a gesture that was far too deliberate to be genuine. "Sorry about the mess, Howard," he said, his voice dropping into a weary octave that vibrated with insincerity. "I spent the morning trying to fix the boiler myself. I just can't afford to call in a specialist right now, with the way the bills are piling up." I looked at his hands as he spoke, noting the dark smudge of grease beneath his fingernails. It looked convincing until I realized the skin of his palms was as soft and uncalloused as a newborn's. My years of inspecting material finishes told me the truth. The grease wasn't oil. It was dark, theatrical makeup, carefully applied to sell a lie. "Self-reliance is a virtue, Marcus," I replied, keeping my voice as flat as a sheet of cold-rolled steel. "Though some things are harder to fix than others." He avoided my eye contact, ushering us into the foyer with a hurried nervousness. Emily stepped past me, her face tight with a concern that Marcus harvested like a cash crop. She reached out to touch his arm, her eyes searching his for some sign of the exhaustion he was faking so effectively. The house felt like a stage set, cold and uninviting. The hallway air carried a draft that felt intentional, a physical manifestation of their supposed financial winter. Have you ever sat at a table where the salt in the air wasn't from the food, but but from the sweat of 1,000 lies. That was the sensation that washed over me as we walked toward the dining room. I felt the weight of the gallery invoices in my pocket, the paper thick and jagged against my thigh. It burned like a brand, a constant reminder of the sleek red Tesla and the Armani suit that Marcus had tucked away like a shameful secret. I watched him limp ahead of us, a performance so dedicated it would have been impressive if it weren't so predatory. In the dining room, Daniel Redmond, 62, greeted me with the practiced, shaky hands of a man who spent more time rehearsing his illness than actually living it. He was seated in a mismatched wooden chair that looked like it had been pulled from a curb on trash day. The light bulb overhead flickered with a rhythmic instability that felt less like a faulty wire and more like a deliberate choice to enhance the atmosphere of destitute gloom. "Howard, thank you for coming," Daniel whispered, his voice, a frail rasp that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a driveway. "It is good to see family, even when times are lean." I sat down across from him, my eyes immediately dropping to the table setting. A roast chicken sat in the center, looking intentionally meager, surrounded by wilted vegetables. But as I reached for a paper napkin, the edge of my hand brushed against the silverware. My fingers recognized the weight and the cool, distinct texture of high-quality sterling silver. It was hidden beneath the cheap paper, a sliver of the truth poking through the carefully maintained facade of their poverty. I felt the invoice in my pocket. It burned like a brand. I watched Daniel as Emily began to serve the plates. He was a master of the subtle tremor, his hands shaking just enough to make the act of holding a fork look like an ordeal. Yet when Emily turned her back to fetch a pitcher of water from the sideboard, the tremor vanished instantly. He adjusted his glass with a grip that was steady, and sure, his eyes darting to Marcus with a look of sharp, clear-headed calculation. They weren't just a father and son. They were a seasoned team of co-conspirators, and the theater they were performing was designed to bleed my daughter dry. Emily returned her movements quick and efficient, her nurse's training kicking in, as she fussed over Daniel's portion. "Emily is an angel for helping with my prescriptions," Daniel said, looking down at the floor, as if the weight of his gratitude was too much to bear. "I do not know where we would be without her." I watched her smile at him, a genuine heartbreaking expression of love that made my blood run cold. Their poverty was a costume, and the seams were already starting to split under the weight of my gaze. Every word out of Daniel's mouth felt like a brick being added to a wall of deception. He spoke about the cost of his treatments and the difficulty of finding a taxi to the clinic, painting a picture of a man trapped by his own failing body and a lack of resources. I maintained my composure, nodding at the appropriate moments, while my mind worked through the logistics of their lie. The contrast between the man in front of me and the man Marcus had been at the gallery was a structural anomaly I couldn't ignore. Then the first crack in Daniel's performance appeared. He began to recount a story about his boredom in the house, but then he mentioned a detail about a charity event he had attended the night before, a gala with a $300 plate fee. The mention was fleeting, a slip of the tongue from a man who had forgotten which version of himself he was supposed to be playing. He froze for a microsecond, the tremor in his hand, returning with sudden exaggerated force, but the damage was done. Emily reached out to steady Daniel's trembling hand, her eyes full of a love that was being harvested for profit. And I realized then that I wasn't just here to eat, I was here to watch a slaughter. I looked at Marcus, who was busy dissecting his chicken, with a focused intensity, and I knew that the real proof wasn't at this table. It was elsewhere, hidden behind the peeling paint and the flickering lights, and I was going to find it. I set my fork down with a deliberate click against the china, the sound echoing like a starting pistol in the suffocating silence of the Redmonds' performative poverty. The table was a theater of the absurd, with Emily leaning over to steady Daniel's hand as he played the part of the dying patriarch with an almost oily dedication. I felt the heat of the gallery invoices in my pocket, a stack of paper that felt like a ticking bomb. I needed to move. I needed to see the physical proof of the rot I knew was hidden beneath this crumbling foundation. I forced a wet hacking cough into my napkin, a sound that made Emily's head snap up in immediate nurse-instilled concern. It was a calculated performance on my part, a necessary lie to dismantle a much larger one. Just a tickle in the throat, honey, I wheezed, waving her back down as she started to rise. "I will find the kitchen and get a glass of water. Stay eat. You need the energy for your shift tomorrow." Marcus looked up, his eyes flat and watchful, tracking me with the predatory stillness I had noticed at the gallery. "Second door on the right." "Howard," he said, his voice smooth and empty of the rasp he used when speaking to Emily. "Don't get lost. This house has a way of swallowing people who wander." I stood up and moved away from the table, my footsteps sounding too loud on the bare scuffed floorboards. I navigated the dark, sterile hallway of the Princeton estate, noting the lack of family photos or personal touches that usually ground a home. It felt like a stage set after the actors had gone home cold hollow and utterly devoid of soul. I bypassed the kitchen entirely, my internal compass locked onto the side door I had seen from the driveway. My fingers were trembling as they gripped the cold brass knob of the door leading to the attached garage. I held my breath, turning it slowly, praying that the hinges were as neglected as the porch paint. The garage door hinge shrieked once, a dry metallic scream that sounded like a warning. I froze, my heartbeat stuttering against my ribs. But the house remained silent, the muffled sounds of clinking silverware continuing from the dining room. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me, the air instantly changing to the smell of cold rubber and premium leather. I didn't need a flashlight. The moonlight filtered through the high, grimy windows, illuminating the shapes of the Redmonds' secrets. In the far corner, a large rectangular shape was draped in a heavy, dusty gray tarp. I moved toward it, my boots crunching on grit. I reached out and grabbed the edge of the rough, abrasive texture of the gray canvas tarp and pulled it back. The cherry-red Tesla I had seen at the gallery was parked there, its paint gleaming even in the dim light like a fresh wound. I reached out and touched the hood. It was still warm. The ticking of the cooling engine was a rhythmic indictment of Marcus's lies. I pressed my palm against the metal, feeling the residual heat of a machine that had been driven hard while Emily was being told her husband was at the office. I moved to the driver's side and pulled the door handle. It was unlocked. I reached into the center console, my fingers brushing against the glove box until I found the digital log for the GPS. I scrolled through the recent destinations. There was no office. There were no escrow meetings. The car had spent every single workday for the last 3 months at an underground casino in the city. How many nursing shifts did it take to pay for the heat still radiating from this luxury machine? The rage that flared in my chest was cold and analytical, the kind of anger that builds a bridge to the truth. I moved beyond the car, searching the shadows for more evidence of the siphoning. Behind a stack of old newspapers and empty paint cans, I found a pile of charity donation boxes. I pulled the flap of the top one open, expecting old clothes. Instead, the glint of expensive glass caught the light. 3 unopened bottles of Macallan 18 whiskey were nestled inside, valued at nearly $1,000 each. They were hidden away like a dragon's hoard, a secret reserve of luxury for the men who were currently pretending to be too poor to fix a boiler. The Macallan bottles sat there like glass pillars of a temple built on my daughter's exhaustion. It was a staggering level of greed. They weren't just taking Emily's money for survival. They were hoarding a fortune while she wore coffee-stained scrubs and skipped meals to save for their fake medical bills. I felt a drop of clammy sweat prickle at the back of my neck. I realized then that this wasn't just a financial scam. It was a psychological siege. They were breaking her spirit so they could pick the bones of her bank account. I began to move toward the back of the garage, searching for anything else that didn't fit the narrative. In a corner workbench tucked under a pile of oily rags, I found a manila folder. I opened it, my eyes scanning the documents. They were brake inspection reports for Emily's Honda. I felt the air leave my lungs as I saw the dates. The reports were marked for February 15th, a date still weeks away. They had already scheduled an inspection for a car that Emily believed was in perfect working order. The implications were a structural failure of morality. They weren't just planning to steal her money. They were planning the end of the critical framework itself. The house was no longer a home. It was a trap. The floorboards in the hallway groaned, followed by the heavy rhythmic thud of Marcus's Ferragamo shoes. The expensive shoes he wasn't supposed to be wearing, stopping right outside the garage door. The faint, expensive scent of his cologne began to seep through the gap under the door. I stood in the shadows of the garage, the tarp still clutched in one hand, paralyzed by the sound of the door handle turning slowly and deliberately. He was coming to check on his investment, and I was standing in the middle of his secret vault. I dove into the narrow gap between a stack of moth-eaten moving blankets and the cold, unyielding side of the Tesla, just as the garage door latch clicked, the sound echoing like the hammer of a revolver being cocked. My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp, ragged thing that I had to swallow back down. The darkness of the garage was absolute, save for the thin sliver of light that cut across the floor as Marcus stepped inside. I pressed my spine against the metal of the car, feeling the lingering warmth of the engine through the blankets. The scratchy texture of the wool bit into my neck, but I didn't dare move. The rhythmic click of Marcus's Ferragamo shoes on the concrete was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. I could hear the rustle of his clothing, the heavy, even tempo of his breathing. He stopped just feet from where I was, crouched, the smell of his expensive cologne and the faint, sweet scent of Macallan drifting into the space between us. I closed my eyes, praying that the shadows were as thick as they felt. "Where did that old man wander off to?" Marcus muttered, his voice dripping with a sudden sharp impatience that made my skin crawl. He moved closer to the tarped car, his hand brushing against the canvas. I heard the sharp rasp of the fabric as he straightened a corner, his presence so close that I could almost feel the heat radiating from his body. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, likely inspecting the very load-bearing lies he had spent months constructing. My heart was a frantic, trapped thing in my chest, and the acrid metallic taste of fear filled my mouth. Finally, the footsteps retreated. The door to the hallway opened and closed, and the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it had mass. I waited, counting to 60 twice before I dared to uncoil my limbs. My nerves were frayed to the breaking point, but the engineering of this situation required more than just survival. It required observation. I slipped out from behind the car and moved to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The house was quiet, but then I heard it, the low hiss sibilance of whispers coming from the butler's pantry just down the hall. I cracked the door open an inch, slipping back into the house's kitchen hallway shadows. I positioned myself behind a heavy velvet curtain, my senses dialed to their absolute limit. He walked past me, 1 foot away. I could smell the Macallan on his breath, a rich oaky scent that stood in mocking contrast to the cheap chicken dinner we had just shared. I could hear Marcus and Daniel now. Their voices were low, but in the oppressive sterile silence of the Princeton hallway, every word carried the weight of a death sentence. "The beneficiary change is finalized," Marcus whispered, and I felt a jolt of ice water surge through my veins. "Plan E is a go for the 15th. Make sure the old man stays clueless." I leaned closer, my fingers digging into the fabric of the curtain. Daniel's voice followed, trembling and weak, but the frailty I heard now didn't sound like illness. It sounded like the crumbling of a soul. Is it really necessary?" he asked. "She has been so good to us, Marcus." The boy, my son-in-law, let out a short, cold laugh. "It is business, Dad. Don't go soft now. Think of the debts. Think of the life we're supposed to be living." I felt a wave of moral revulsion so strong, I nearly gagged. They weren't just talking about money anymore. Plan E wasn't a financial exit strategy. It was an execution. They were planning to orchestrate an accident involving Emily on that steep, treacherous hill near the hospital where she worked. The reports I had seen in the garage, the future-dated brake inspections, clicked into place with a sickening finality. It was a murder plot designed to look like a mechanical failure. How do you breathe when you're standing in a room with 2 men discussing your daughter's expiration date? My mind, trained for decades to look for the points where structures fail, was now mapping out the destruction of my own family. They weren't just looking for a payout. They were looking for a clean break, a way to liquidate Emily to pay for their casino debts and their Macallan habits. I stood there paralyzed by the sheer calculated evil of it until the sound of Emily calling my name from the dining room snapped me back to the present. I had to move. I had to become the pylon again. I forced my features into a mask of confused frailty and stumbled back into the dining area, just as Marcus and Daniel re-entered from the pantry. I feigned a dizzy spell, gripping the back of a chair for support. "You look pale, Dad," Emily said, her face full of genuine agonizing concern as she took my arm. "Let us get you home." I looked at Marcus, who was watching me with a suspicious, narrow gaze, and I knew I had to play the part of the fading old man perfectly. "Just the heat in here, honey," I managed to rasp. "It is suffocating." Walking out that front door felt like stepping out of a tomb while the stone was still being rolled into place. The night air was sharp and cold, but it did little to clear the fog of horror in my mind. We walked to the car, Marcus trailing behind us like a shadow. As Daniel stood on the porch, he reached out to shake my hand, a gesture that felt like a betrayal, until I felt the crinkle of paper. He slipped a small, crumpled scrap into my palm, his eyes meeting mine for a split second, with a look of desperate, hollow pleading. I didn't look at it until we were miles away, Emily driving in a silence she thought was peaceful. I pulled the paper out in the dim light of the dashboard. "Help her," the scrawl said. The handwriting was shaky, a confession of cowardice, and a confirmation of the nightmare. I gripped the scrap of paper in my pocket, my mind racing through the engineering of a brake line failure, and realized that, according to the calendar on the kitchen wall, I only had 28 days to dismantle a murder. I ignored the cold ache in my lower back as I slammed my apartment door shut, the jagged edges of those gallery invoices still burning through my pocket like radioactive isotopes. The drive back from the Redmond estate had been a masterclass in suppressed terror, watching my daughter smile at a man who was already measuring her for a coffin. I needed the truth not in the form of whispered threats or cryptic notes, but in the cold, hard data that Marcus Redmond couldn't charm or gaslight. My small apartment in Maplewood felt smaller tonight, the shadows stretching across the walls as I moved with a mechanical urgency. I cleared the scarred surface of my kitchen table, sweeping aside a stack of engineering journals to make room for my workstation. I laid out my laptop, a fresh legal pad that smelled faintly of dry paper, and my specialized bridge inspection magnifying glass, a relic of a career spent finding the invisible cracks that lead to catastrophe. I was back in the field now, but the structure I was inspecting was my own daughter's life. I sat down, the sharp rhythmic clicking of the keyboard keys echoing in the silence. I accessed the shared bank account Emily and I had maintained for years, a safety net I had helped her set up for emergencies. My fingers hovered over the keys for a second, a flicker of guilt crossing my mind for invading her privacy, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of Marcus's smirk. I began the grueling process of cross-referencing every withdrawal. I looked for the outliers, the small leaks that indicate a failing valve. I discovered that Marcus had been far more efficient than I feared. He had actually changed the alert settings on the banking app to his own phone number, ensuring Emily never received a single notification of the large transfers he was making. It was a structural bypass designed to keep the victim unaware while the pressure mounted. Structural integrity isn't just about steel, I muttered to the empty room, my voice sounding like gravel. It's about following the load path until you find the failure. Have you ever looked into a mirror and realized you were the only person left who could see the truth? The man in the glass looked tired, but his eyes were sharp with the clarity of a man who finally understands the nature of the rot. I began to map the hemorrhage. Over the last 18 months, exactly $47,200 had been siphoned from Emily's savings and her grueling salary. I saw the patterns emerging on my legal pad, a series of red ink marks that looked like blood spray. The largest withdrawals, $5,000 here, $3,000 there, occurred precisely 48 hours before the high-value pickups Walter Green had mentioned at the gallery. Marcus wasn't just spending his own mysterious funds. He was methodically stripping my daughter of every cent she earned in the oncology ward. $47,000, I whispered, my voice cracking in the quiet apartment. She skipped her own birthday dinner to save $300 for their future, and he spent 10 times that on a single canvas to impress a room full of strangers. I felt a surge of parental agony that nearly knocked me back, a physical blow to the chest. The hum of the apartment's refrigerator seemed to grow louder, a mocking, persistent sound in the heavy silence. The spreadsheet didn't lie. Numbers have a cold, honest brutality that people lack. They don't have a persona. They don't wear Armani suits. They just tell you how much has been taken. I turned my focus to Marcus's supposed business. I performed a deep search of his real estate investment firm, digging through public records and domain registrations. I found exactly what I expected: a ghost entity. It was a shell registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, a paper fortress with no real foundation. I navigated to the company's website, which was a lazy template populated with stock photos of buildings in Chicago, not a single one from Princeton or anywhere else in Jersey. Using my technical expertise, I traced the IP address of the domain registration. It didn't lead to an office building or a corporate server. It led directly to the red Tesla's built-in cellular modem. Marcus was the sole operator of the fraud, running his entire empire from the driver's seat of a car my daughter was paying for. There are no projects, no partners, no profit, I realized, clicking through the dead links. There's only a predator and his prey. I stared at a sticky residue of a coffee ring on the kitchen table, a mundane detail that felt absurd in the face of such calculated malice. He had turned my daughter into a resource to be mined, a load-bearing pillar he intended to demolish once the well ran dry. The blue light of the screen washed over me like a digital ghost, haunting me with every zero on the ledger. But there was one final discovery to be made. I dug into the medical consults payments, the money Emily thought was going to save Daniel's heart. I tracked the routing numbers, bypassing the layers of encryption Marcus had used to hide the destination. They weren't going to a hospital or a specialist. The digital audit revealed they were being routed into a high-stakes offshore gambling account, registered to an alias, the Architect. The irony was almost too much to bear. Marcus saw himself as the builder of his own destiny, while he was actually the one dismantling everything around him. I sat back, my eyes burning from the glare of the laptop, the total financial drain finally calculated. I had the blueprint of his crime, the exact measurements of his betrayal. As I stared at the blinking cursor on the offshore account's login page, the silence was shattered. My landline phone, a relic I kept for emergencies, shrieked in the darkness, a jarring mechanical sound that shouldn't have happened at midnight. The mechanical scream of my 1980s wall phone ripped through the silence of my apartment, vibrating against the wood like a warning siren from a sinking ship. I surged toward the hallway, my pulse thundering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. In the dead of night, a ringing phone is never an invitation. It is an intrusion, a harbinger of hospital corridors or police tape. I gripped the plastic receiver, my knuckles white, and pressed it to my ear with a trembling hand. I expected the smooth, mocking drawl of Marcus, or perhaps a frantic nurse calling about Emily. Instead, I heard a hushed, jagged intake of breath. "Howard, it's Patricia." The voice was thin, brittle as old parchment. Patricia Long, my 66-year-old neighbor, who spent 3 decades as a court stenographer, was a woman who lived by the precision of language and the vigilance of her window blinds. She usually kept to the shadows of the street, observing the neighborhood with a professional detachment. But tonight she sounded like a woman whose composure had suffered a catastrophic failure. She told me she had seen something I needed to see immediately, but she refused to speak the details over a line she clearly no longer trusted. I asked if Emily was okay if Marcus was with her, my voice a low growl of protective dread. She only told me to wait until dawn, that she would come to my door when the light was safe. The line went dead. The hum of the dial tone was the only thing left in the room. I sat in the darkness for hours, the blue glow of my laptop screen mocking my inability to act. I thought of Emily tucked away in that Princeton house of cards and the cold weight of the invoices in my pocket. When the first gray streaks of dawn finally bled through the curtains, a sharp, rhythmic knock sounded at my door. I opened it to find Patricia standing in the cold morning air, her coat buttoned unevenly, and her eyes bloodshot from a night spent in a state of hypervigilance. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply walked into my kitchen and placed a printed photograph on the table. It was a pixelated bright image, the kind caught by a high-end surveillance system. Her nephew worked security at the Riverside Grand Casino, she explained, and he had recognized Marcus from a local news segment about real estate. The man in the photo was undeniably Marcus Redmond, but he wasn't the struggling husband I had seen at dinner. He was wearing the same Armani suit from the gallery, his face relaxed and radiating an immense casual wealth. He had his arm draped around a young blonde woman, their heads tilted together in a shared, intimate laugh. My nephew said he dropped $5,000 in 20 minutes like it was pocket change. Howard, Patricia whispered, her hands shaking as she pulled her coat tighter. "And who is she?" I asked, staring at the woman leaning against my son-in-law. My eyes locked onto a glint of light at the woman's throat. I reached for my magnifying glass, the lens enlarging the pixelated details. The air left my lungs as the structure of the lie collapsed further. The woman was wearing a distinctive gold filigree necklace, a piece I recognized as a Palmer family heirloom, a piece Emily thought she had lost months ago during a move. It wasn't lost. It had been harvested, taken from my daughter's jewelry box to adorn the neck of a stranger in a VIP lounge. How much of your soul do you have to sell before you can laugh like that while your wife is bleeding her savings dry? The disgust I felt was a physical thing, a sour heat that rose from my stomach and turned into a glacial, calculating rage. Marcus was funding a life of high-stakes gambling and infidelity with the very money Emily earned in the oncology ward, skipping her own meals to pay for a father-in-law's fake medication. I looked closer at the background of the casino photo, my eyes scanning the shadows behind the high-stakes table. My training as an inspector had taught me to look past the focal point, to find the hidden supports or the subtle cracks in the periphery. There, standing near a tray of drinks, was a second figure. He was standing perfectly upright, his posture straight and his face clear of the frail gray pallor he had worn at the dinner table. It was Daniel Redmond. He wasn't bedridden. He wasn't dying of a failing heart. He was perfectly healthy, acting as a gopher for his son in a den of vice. The betrayal was absolute, a multi-generational conspiracy of predators. "Howard, I'm so sorry," Patricia said, her voice a soft staccato in the quiet kitchen. "I knew I couldn't keep this." I thanked her, my mind already archiving the photo as a piece of terminal evidence. I spent the next hour digitizing the image, adding it to the structural failure file I was building. The photo was a crack in the dam, and I could feel the cold weight of the flood beginning to press against my chest. I tried to eat, but the smell of burnt toast from my forgotten breakfast made my stomach churn. I sat at the table mapping out the next phase of my defense. A $200 an hour nurse funding a $5,000 a night habit. The math doesn't just fail, it's murderous. The math was an indictment of a man who viewed my daughter as a resource to be depleted until the structure snapped. As I stared at the screen, my computer pinged with a new email, an automated notification from Emily's bank. Someone had just attempted to withdraw $10,000 from her equity line, and the location of the ATM was less than 2 blocks from my front door. The proximity felt like a physical assault. It wasn't just a digital theft anymore. The predator was in my immediate vicinity, moving with a desperate sudden speed. I stood up my chair, scraping against the floorboards, and grabbed my coat. The time for observation had ended. The sound of a car door slamming outside the apartment building echoed through the walls, and I knew before I reached the window that the final phase of Marcus's plan had just arrived at my doorstep. I didn't wait for the knock. I threw the door open just as Emily's hand was raised to her face, a pale, tear-streaked map of the devastation Marcus Redmond had spent 2 years perfecting. She stumbled into the foyer, her shoulders shaking so violently that I had to reach out and physically steady her. The sound of her car door slamming outside was still echoing in the hallway, a final sharp punctuation to her arrival. She looked smaller than I remembered, her scrub top wrinkled, and her hair escaping its clip in frantic, wispy strands. I led her into the kitchen, the very room where I had spent the night dissecting her life on a spreadsheet. She didn't even notice the laptop or the legal pads. She just collapsed into a chair, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. "Marcus is pushing me." "Dad," she sobbed, her voice breaking on every other word. "He says if I don't sign the papers by Friday, Daniel will die. He said the cardiovascular specialist needs a $50,000 deposit because the insurance won't cover the experimental valve." I felt a surge of protective rage so hot, it made my vision blur. I held her shoulders, forcing her to look at me, to see the steady pylon I needed to be for her. "Emily, look at me. You are not a failure. You are a target. He is using your vocation as a weapon against you. Do not sign that paper." I told her then, as gently as I could, that the specialist Marcus had named didn't exist on the hospital's payroll. I watched the confusion in her eyes fight with the indoctrination Marcus had instilled, a structural battle for her very soul. "He said my nursing degree is useless if I can't even save my own family," she whispered, repeating the gaslighting script he had fed her. "He said I was being selfish for questioning the cost." I pulled her close, the damp, salty residue of her tears soaking into my shirt. "How do you tell your daughter that her husband's love is just a high-interest loan he never intends to pay back?" I couldn't give her the full horror yet. The casino photos or the Macallan bottles not. While she was this fragile, I needed her to trust me not just as her father, but as the only person who could see the cracks in the bridge. I managed to calm her down, making her a cup of tea she didn't touch. I insisted that I would use my old engineering contacts on the hospital board to verify the medical quotes. I bought myself 48 hours of time, a desperate window to build a real defense. Once she left, the silence of the apartment felt like an accusation. I realized I could no longer fight this battle with spreadsheets alone. I needed a professional to watch the shadows while I watched Emily. I felt my savings account dwindle to a 4-digit number as I prepared for the next step. It didn't matter. Steel is expensive, but a life is priceless. I drove to the Maplewood Diner, a place where the air always smells of burnt coffee and maple syrup, to meet a man I hadn't seen in a decade. Tom Crawford, 62, was a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of the very granite bridge footings we used to inspect together, his eyes 2 chips of cold, unblinking flint. He was already sitting in the back booth, his hands wrapped around a heavy ceramic mug. He had traded bridge inspection for a discreet private investigation firm years ago, and he was the only man I trusted to help me navigate a structural failure this deep. I slid into the booth and laid out the invoices, the casino photo, and the digital audit. I didn't need a report. "Tom," I told him, my voice low and steady, "I need a load-bearing analysis of this man's lies. I need to know where to kick so the whole thing collapses." Tom studied the photo of Marcus and the blonde woman for a long time, his expression tightening into something professional and grim. "Howard, if half of what you've shown me is true, you're not dealing with a husband," Tom said, his voice a low rumble. "You're dealing with a professional apex predator." He tapped the photo of the blonde woman. "I know this face. She isn't a mistress. She's a known closer for a multi-state marriage fraud ring. If she's in the picture, Marcus isn't just a gambler. He's part of an organized syndicate. The revelation hit me with the force of a wrecking ball. This wasn't a solo act of greed. It was a factory-grade operation. I reached into my coat and pulled out $500, half of my remaining emergency liquid cash. I pushed it across the greasy laminate table. Put him under the glass, Tom. Every move he makes. Tom Crawford didn't look like a PI. He looked like the gray-weathered pylon of a bridge, immovable, silent, and capable of holding up immense weight. He took the money, but his eyes never left mine. He knew the cost of what I was asking, both financially and emotionally. Tom slid a small black GPS tracker across the table toward me. The high-pitched electronic squeal as he activated it sounded like a hunting bird's cry. He checked his own tablet, his brow furrowing as the signal stabilized. "He's at a Porsche dealership right now, Howard. If you want to see where your daughter's $50,000 is really going, I suggest we start moving." I gripped the tracker, the cold plastic feeling like a weapon in my palm. The transition from passive observation to active counterinsurgency was complete. I followed Tom out of the diner, the bell above the door, chiming a warning I was more than ready to heed. The roar of a high-performance engine echoing through a glass-walled showroom was already playing in my mind, a siren song of the betrayal I was about to witness firsthand. The roar of a precision-tuned flat-six engine didn't just vibrate the glass walls of the showroom. It shredded the last lingering shred of my hope that this was all just a terrible engineering error. I sat in the passenger seat of Tom Crawford's nondescript surveillance van, the interior smelling of stale upholstery and the faint ozone tang of high-end electronics. Through the one-way glass, I watched the cherry-red Porsche 911 scream past the dealership's entrance, its metallic paint blindingly bright under the Jersey sun. Tom sat beside me, his face a mask of professional detachment, his hands dancing across a keyboard as he monitored the audio feed from the bug he'd planted on Marcus's poverty vehicle back at the Princeton house. We had tracked that rusted Camry to a storage locker 2 towns over, where Marcus had performed another lightning-fast wardrobe switch. Now he was back in the Armani, being greeted by a Porsche salesman who bowed as if he were welcoming royalty. "Look at him, Tom." I whispered, my voice sounding like grinding gravel even to my own ears. "He is not just buying a car, he is wearing a life that belongs to my daughter. He's spending the second mortgage she took out on her mother's condo like it's play money." Tom didn't look up, but his jaw tightened. "Keep your head down, Howard," he cautioned. "Predators are most dangerous when they're feeding. Right now he's in the zone. He thinks he's invisible." I adjusted the high-powered binoculars, the cold, hard rims digging into my eye sockets as I watched Marcus laugh with the salesman. It was a genuine carefree sound that drifted through our patched-in audio feed, a sound I had never heard him make around Emily. Around her, he was always the weighted pylon groaning under the pressure of fake debts. Here, he was the architect of his own gluttonous joy. I thought of Emily at that very moment, likely kneeling on a hard hospital floor, her coffee-stained scrubs a testament to the $50,000 lie she was killing herself to fund. The contrast was a structural failure of the soul. Marcus leaned against the hood of the Porsche, tapping his phone with the same practiced indifference I'd seen at the gallery. He turned the screen toward a blonde woman who had just stepped out of a sleek SUV to join him. My heart did a slow, nauseating roll. Marcus showed her a photo on his phone. It was a crisp, clear image of Emily's signed life insurance application. I recognized her handwriting instantly. She'd told me she was signing up for a new nursing union health benefit. She had no idea she was actually signing her own appraisal document. He laughed, a genuine carefree sound that felt like a slap to my face. The blonde woman smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that didn't reach her eyes. They looked like 2 engineers reviewing the final blueprints for a demolition. Tom followed them as they left the dealership, the Porsche remaining behind for final detailing, while they took the mistress's SUV to a high-end restaurant downtown. We settled into a spot across the street, the van's ventilation humming a low, anxious tune. Through the binoculars, I watched them take a table with outdoor seating. It was a $200 lunch easily. They toasted with glasses of Macallan, the amber liquid catching the light. I recognized the bottle. It was the same high-end scotch I'd found hidden under the tarps in the Redmond garage. Then Marcus reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet jewelry box. My breath hitched. He handed it to her, and as she opened it, I saw the shimmer of pearls. "She's wearing the Palmer pearls, Tom." I rasped the words, burning my throat. My wife's pearls. Emily thought she'd lost them in the move. He didn't just steal her future, he's stripping the past off her neck to pay for his present. How many double shifts in an oncology ward does it take to buy a velvet box from Tiffany? The question was a rhythmic throb in my temples. I watched the woman clasp the necklace around her throat, her fingers nimble and greedy. Tom was busy snapping high-resolution photos, his camera's shutter, a soft mechanical click, click, click that sounded like a countdown. "This isn't a medical emergency," Howard Tom said, his voice a low rumble of clinical observation. "This is a lifestyle upgrade funded by your daughter's blood, sweat, and tears. He's not just cheating on her, he's liquidating her." I watched Marcus lean in to kiss the woman, but my eyes were drawn to his wrist. He checked his watch, the high-end Apple Watch Ultra I saw at the gallery. He whispered something into her ear that made her smile, widen her teeth white and sharp against the sunlight. Marcus was a parasite that had learned to mimic the heartbeat of the host he was killing, and I was the only one who could see the needle he was using to drain her dry. Tom turned his tablet toward me, his brow furrowed in a way that made my stomach drop further. He had been running a background check on the mistress while we watched the lunch. "Howard, she isn't just a mistress," he revealed, clicking through a professional database. "Her name is Lydia Vance. She's a senior insurance adjuster for the very firm that just fast-tracked Emily's new policy. The blonde woman wasn't just a side piece. She was the inside man. She was the one who had approved the high-value policy without the standard medical physicals that Emily's age and history should have required. The fraud ring didn't just have a hammer and Marcus. They had the legal armor to ensure the payout would be seamless. Steely resolve began to replace the raw anger in my chest. We were no longer just looking at a cheating husband. We were looking at a professional syndicate. I took the bottle of water Tom offered, the plastic crinkling in my shaking hand. The taste was crisp and clean, but it couldn't wash away the bitterness of the betrayal. Marcus leaned in for one last kiss, his hand resting casually on the woman's shoulder. As he pulled back, he checked his watch again, his expression shifting into something dark and urgent. He whispered a final word, and the woman nodded, her eyes darting toward the street, as if she were checking the time on a ticking bomb. The predator's smile didn't just haunt me. It mapped out a cold, calculated geometry of my daughter's demise that I could finally see with terrifying engineering precision. I sat in the cramped, humid interior of Tom Crawford's van, the blue light from the dual monitors washing over my face like a digital ghost. The restaurant scene was still a jagged loop in my mind, but here in Tom's mobile office, the emotional static was being stripped away, leaving only the structural failure of a man's morality. Tom was hunched over his keyboard, the sharp smell of ozone from the overworked computer hardware filling the small space. He was using a specialized software suite to clean up the audio we had captured from Marcus's table. I gripped a cup of black coffee, the liquid bitter and cold, but it was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking. I watched the waveform on the screen jump and stutter until finally the sibilant whispers of my son-in-law became audible. He didn't refer to Emily by her name. He called her the asset. He spoke to that blonde adjuster about the February 15th target date with the same casual tone an engineer might use to discuss a bridge demolition. It was a sickening betrayal. I realized that the nursing union benefits Emily thought she was signing for were actually high-value life insurance documents meticulously prepared by the woman sitting across from Marcus. I discovered that the initial premium for this $500,000 policy was being paid directly from the $50,000 loan Emily hadn't even signed yet. Marcus had already forged her temporary authorization to bridge the gap. The audio hissed. Then through the static, I heard my daughter's name spoken like a death sentence. Tom hit a key, freezing the frame. "Steady, Howard," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of my rage. "We need to follow the policy trail. This is the load-bearing lie of his entire operation." I watched as Tom's fingers danced across the keys, breaching the secure portal of the insurance company using the credentials I had helped him identify from Marcus's digital footprint. We found it, a $500,000 term life policy on Emily Palmer. Marcus Redmond was the primary and sole beneficiary. My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll as I saw that the policy had been fast-tracked through Grayson & Associates, the same legal firm linked to the syndicate. $500,000. That was the price he had put on her head. I felt a sense of vertigo, the kind you get when you realize the bridge you're standing on has no pilings left. How do you calculate the stress load on a heart that knows its own child is being appraised for parts? The van felt smaller, the air thicker with the scent of his greed. Every cent she earned in that oncology ward was being used to fund a policy that only paid out if she stopped breathing. I reached for my magnifying glass, pulling the dry, parchment-like policy printouts closer to the flickering monitor. I began to scrutinize the fine print, looking for the stress points. That's when I found it a double indemnity rider. The language was clear, clinical, and predatory. The payout would jump to $1 million if the death was ruled accidental. I cross-referenced this with the brake inspection notes I had found in Marcus's garage. It was an engineering problem for him, Tom. I felt the words come out as a cold, dead rasp. If he cuts the line at the right angle, it's not murder. It's $1 million payday. He was planning to make Emily's death look like a tragic mechanical failure on that steep hill she climbed every morning for her commute. The policy document was a blueprint for a funeral signed in ink that smelled like my daughter's perfume. I could see the whole plan now, the geometry of the crime. The loan, the car, the mistress, and the dead daughter. It was all balanced on a single moment of kinetic failure. The icy tactical fear for Emily's immediate survival was so intense it almost eclipsed the anger. I wasn't just looking at a thief anymore. I was looking at a man who had turned his wife into a terminal project. Tom pointed to a line of code on the secondary monitor, his brow furrowed in a way that made my blood run cold. Howard, look. He's not just watching her finances. He's installed a remote kill switch on the GPS of her Honda. He can track her to the exact inch of that steep hill whenever he wants. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a plan for the 15th. It was a system. Tom uncovered that the February 15th target wasn't just a random date. It was the day Marcus's massive gambling debt to the syndicate was due. He wasn't just killing her for the money. He was killing her to save his own skin. Emily's accident was a mandatory execution. I stared at the screen, the blue light burning into my retinas. The man I had led into my family, the man I had shared meals with, was currently monitoring my daughter's location like a hunter tracking a deer. The remote kill switch was the final piece of the machine. He could wait for the perfect moment of vulnerability and ensure the failure was absolute. My daughter was living in a trap I hadn't even known existed, and the timer was counting down to a deadline I could finally see. I took a deep breath, the ozone and stale air of the van feeling like the only real things in a world made of lies. I didn't just want to stop him anymore. I wanted to dismantle him, bolt by bolt, until there was nothing left but the wreckage of his own design. Numbers have a cold, honest brutality, but it was the silence of 7 dead or vanished women that finally turned my blood into the very ice Marcus Redmond intended for my daughter. I sat in the dim blue-tinted interior of Tom Crawford's mobile office, the air smelling of dry, dusty paper, and the sharp, stinging static of 3 high-end monitors. Tom had spent the last hour feeding a bag of shredded remains from Marcus's private office trash into a digital reconstructor. I watched the screen with an engineer's fixated precision, my hand steady only because of the sheer weight of the adrenaline. Strips of paper, once nothing more than white confetti, began to align into coherent sentences. We were looking at a series of emails between Marcus and a contact saved only as TC. They weren't discussing real estate or escrow. They were discussing the angle of a cut. The correspondence was a step-by-step guide on how to sabotage the brake lines of a Honda Civic to ensure a slow, undetectable leak. The goal was for the failure to occur exactly at the maximum load point of the Cooper Hill descent, the very route Emily traveled every single morning to reach the hospital. The technical detail was nauseating. It was a planned structural collapse of a human life, engineered with the same care I used to give to a suspension bridge. I felt a heavy metallic taste of iron in my mouth from biting my lip as the realization of the entry twist settled in. Marcus wasn't just a solo predator. The TC in the emails was Travis Coleman, a man whose digital footprint Tom was already beginning to trace. Coleman wasn't just a sounding board. He was the logistics expert who provided the staged accident locations and coordinated the cleanup crews to ensure no insurance adjuster outside their ring ever saw the wreckage, the hill. He chose the hill where she always stops to get me coffee. It was a tactical choice, a location where speed and gravity would do the work that Marcus was too cowardly to finish with his own hands. I looked at the high-pitched hum of the data processing server, the noise sounding like a swarm of insects inside my skull. Before I reveal the shocking data Tom just pulled from that encrypted drive, are you still with me? Comment mastermind if you believe Marcus is the true architect of this scheme. Or puppet if you think he's just a pawn in a much larger game. I'd love to hear your reasoning. Please note that certain creative details are added for storytelling, but the lesson I'm sharing remains the priority. Tom hit a final key, and the van's cabin seemed to grow colder as the dawn light began to bleed through the reinforced glass. He had run Marcus's biometric data through a federal database he still had access to from his days in the Bureau. He looked at me, his eyes two chips of cold, unblinking flint. "He is a professional widower." Howard Tom said, his voice a low rumble of clinical horror. "Emily isn't his wife. She's his 7th contract." I stared at the screen as the names appeared. Marcus Redmond was an alias, one of many. This man had been married twice before, once in Ohio and once in Oregon. One wife was officially listed as missing a cold case that had never been closed. The other had died in a single-vehicle rollover in 2019. The payout for that accident was $300,000. I felt a surge of visceral revulsion. How many times can a man marry death before the devil decides to collect the debt? The scale of the predatory evil was staggering. Marcus didn't see women. He saw insurance policies with heartbeats. I began to cross-reference the budget planning spreadsheet fragments we had reconstructed with the names on the screen. The spreadsheet was a graveyard of dreams, each row a life dismantled with a keystroke. We identified 7 women across 3 states who had been scammed out of a total of $800,000. The $15,000 Emily had already lost wasn't the goal, it was the overhead. It was the setup fee for the $1 million double indemnity payout Marcus was currently engineering. 7 lives for $800,000. He's efficient, I'll give him that. I whispered, my voice cracking with a murderous protectiveness. But he didn't account for a father who knows how to read the stress points in a bridge. I felt a grim resolve hardening in my chest, a structural reinforcement of my own will. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was the counterweight. Tom leaned in, pointing to a specific note in the 2019 file. It turned out the death had been originally ruled a suicide, but a later amendment changed it to accidental. The reconstructed emails showed Marcus had bribed a local coroner to make the change. The system hadn't failed. It had been bought. I looked at the final reconstructed fragment that Tom had managed to pull from the bottom of the bag. It wasn't a bank statement or an email. It was a digital scan of a photo, a high-resolution image of my own apartment building. Across the back in Marcus's precise architectural handwriting were the words, "Secondary beneficiary obstacle." The iron taste in my mouth returned stronger this time. I wasn't just an inconvenient father-in-law. I was a variable in his equation that needed to be canceled out. He knew I was looking. He knew I was the only piling left holding up the bridge Emily was walking across. The realization that I was also a target didn't bring fear, only a cold, calculated urgency. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly 7 in the morning. Emily would be leaving for her shift soon, heading toward the hill, heading toward the failure point. I grabbed my coat, the static of the monitors still making the hair on my arms stand up. We didn't have 28 days anymore. If I was the obstacle, he wasn't going to wait for the brakes to fail. He was going to move now. The vibration of my phone against the metal van desk didn't just break the silence. It felt like the first snap of a suspension cable on a bridge destined to fall. I snatched the device from the console, my knuckles white and my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic, uneven rhythm. I had just been staring at the reconstructed fragment identifying me as a secondary obstacle, but I hadn't expected the hammer to fall so quickly. The screen showed an unfamiliar number from the hospital where Emily worked. I answered, my voice a low, jagged rasp. "Mr. Palmer." It was Sarah, a nurse from the oncology ward. We were worried. Emily left her shift 4 hours early because her husband Marcus called and said you'd had a stroke and were being rushed to the ICU. She was frantic, "Mr. Palmer. We've been trying to reach you to see which floor you were on." The air left my lungs as if I'd been struck by a physical blow. "I am fine, Sarah." I managed to say the words tasting like cold copper. "I am perfectly fine. I haven't been to any hospital." "When exactly did they leave?" As she gave me the time, a sickening realization washed over me. Marcus had used my own mortality as bait, a cruel irony that bypassed all of Emily's nursing defenses. He had accelerated the timeline for Plan E, moving the deadline from mid-February to this very moment. He used me. He used my own death to lure her into his trap. I discovered the depth of his meticulous malice when I checked my personal files on the cloud. Marcus hadn't just lied. He had somehow gained access to my medical portal and forged us a final directive and a do not resuscitate order in my name. He had crafted a legal wall to ensure that if Emily tried to call 911, the responders would be met with a document signed by me instructing them to let me go. It was designed to make her feel helpless, to force her to rely entirely on Marcus, to drive her to a hospital that didn't even have me admitted. Tom Crawford saw the look on my face and didn't ask questions. He threw the van into gear, the tires screaming against the asphalt as we peeled out of the surveillance position. I tried calling Emily repeatedly, my thumb bruising against the screen, but each call was sucked into the void of her voicemail. The digital world I had mastered over the last few days was suddenly useless, replaced by the primitive, agonizing physics of distance and speed. How many miles of asphalt can a man burn through before his soul catches fire? We were tearing down Route 17, the engine of the van roaring in a desperate duet with the wind. I watched the GPS tracker Tom had installed on Emily's Honda. The icon was stationary, pinned like a dead moth to the map at the Redmond residence in Princeton. But there was a darker detail. The remote kill switch we'd discovered had been activated. Her car was a brick, its electronics fried by a husband who wanted to make sure she couldn't drive away. I gripped my heavy engineering flashlight, the cold aircraft-grade aluminum, feeling like a makeshift mace in my hand. I didn't have a gun, but I had 40 years of understanding how things break. If Marcus Redmond wanted a structural failure, I was going to give him one he hadn't accounted for in his blueprints. "Drive faster, Tom." I growled, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't spend my life studying load-bearing structures to watch my own heart collapse in that house. We arrived at the Princeton estate to find a scene of eerie, curated stillness. The rusted Camry sat in the driveway like a sentinel of fake poverty, but there was no sign of the red Tesla or any movement behind the windows. The house looked different than it had at dinner. The peeling paint and unkempt hedges no longer looked like misfortune, but like camouflage. I was out of the van before Tom had even come to a full stop. I found the front door unlocked, swinging open with a heavy, ominous ease. Inside the house didn't smell like overcooked chicken or the stale air of a sick room. It smelled of sharp medicinal chemicals, a stinging bitter scent of crushed pills and antiseptic that made my throat constrict. The silence was absolute until I heard it, a faint rhythmic thumping coming from beneath the floorboards. It was the sound of a struggle muffled by layers of wood and insulation. I followed the noise to the basement door. My hand shook as I turned the knob, the darkness of the stairs yawning open like the throat of a beast. The basement air was a stagnant pool of chemical rot, drowning the life out of the only thing I had left. I descended the stairs, my flashlight cutting a violent path through the gloom. There, slumped against a cold concrete pillar, was Emily. She looked small, her nurse's uniform stained with the dust of the floor. Her eyes were open but glassy, drifting aimlessly as if she were trying to watch two worlds at once. "Emily, honey. It's Dad. Open your eyes. Look at me." I dropped to my knees, the cold, damp concrete stinging my skin. I pulled her into my arms, her body heavy and uncoordinated. "Dad," she whispered, her voice a slurred, terrifying ghost of itself. "Why? Why are there two of you?" Marcus said. He said the pills were for my headache. He said you were already gone. I felt a surge of visceral horror as I realized how close he had come to the finish line. As I lifted her, my flashlight beam caught a small plastic bottle rolling across the floor. I picked it up, reading the label. It was a half-empty bottle of benzodiazepines with Daniel Redmond's name on it. The sick father hadn't been a victim. He had been the quartermaster, providing the weapons for my daughter's sedation. I stood up, cradling Emily's limp weight against my chest, ready to carry her out of that tomb. Then the silence of the house was punctuated by a sound that made my blood freeze. I heard the heavy metallic scrape of the basement door being locked from the outside, followed by the distinctive electric hum of the Tesla pulling into the garage directly above our heads. I didn't wait for Marcus to descend. I threw my entire weight against the rusted basement window frame, the glass shattering like the illusions I had let my daughter live in for far too long. The sound of heavy footsteps crossing the floorboards directly overhead sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my aging joints. I knew that metallic scrape of the door being locked wasn't just a hurdle. It was the final seal on Marcus's original plan. He wanted us here trapped in the dark while he staged the next phase. I ignored the sharp, jagged sting of glass cutting my palm as I cleared the shards from the frame. My blood smeared against the white peeling paint, but I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the weight of Emily, limp and smelling of chemical sedation, draped over my shoulder. I had to get her out. I discovered that the vitamins Marcus had been forcing on her weren't just random sedatives. I found a discarded blister pack in the corner of the basement that matched Daniel's heart. Medication-powerful beta blockers mixed with benzos. Marcus hadn't just drugged her. He had stolen them from Daniel's genuine stash, intending to frame the sickly father for an accidental overdose if the Hill plot failed. It was a secondary structural failure he'd engineered into the lie, a backup plan in case the car didn't do the job. I hoisted Emily toward the narrow opening, my muscles screaming under the load. I was 69 years old, but in that moment I moved with the desperate strength of a man who was holding the last intact pylon of a collapsing bridge. I pushed her through the window first, watching her slide onto the damp, cold earth of the backyard. The footsteps above stopped right over the basement stairs. I scrambled up after her, my boots kicking at the concrete wall, until I tumbled out into the overgrown grass. The house lights flared to life behind us, casting long, predatory shadows across the lawn. "Keep your head down, Emily," I rasped, though she was barely conscious enough to hear me. "Don't look back at the house. Just keep moving." I dragged her toward the tree line, my breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches that burned my lungs. The van tires screamed. It was the only sound louder than the shattering of my own composure. Tom Crawford slid the side door open before the vehicle had even fully stopped. "Howard, get in." "I've got the paramedics on the line," Tom shouted over the engine's roar. I threw Emily inside and dived in after her, the van peeling away just as the back door of the Redmond estate flew open, a dark silhouette framed in the sudden blinding yellow light of the foyer. By the time we reached St. Mary's ER, the panic had settled into a cold clinical focus. I watched through the small window of the trauma bay as the nurses moved with a synchronized efficiency that reminded me of a well-drilled repair crew. They stripped her of her clothes, the very scrubs she had been wearing, when Marcus lured her into the trap and started the IV fluids. The rhythmic mechanical chirp of the heart monitor was the only thing that kept me anchored to the floor. The ER doctor, a woman with tired eyes and a firm grip, stepped out to speak to me. "She's lucky you found her when you did, Mr. Palmer. Another hour and the combination of her exhaustion and the dosage could have caused her respiratory failure. She was essentially drowning in her own sleep. How do you explain to a child that the monster under the bed eventually grew up and married her?" I sat by her bed for hours, clutching her limp. Pale hand as the hospital-grade floor wax filled my nostrils with its sterile chemical scent. I watched the color slowly return to her face, a slow sunrise after a night of absolute darkness. I sat there with my legal pad and the reconstructed files, waiting for the moment the structural integrity of her world would finally give way. Emily finally stirred around 10 o'clock. Her eyes drifted open, glassy and confused, scanning the harsh fluorescent lights of the ceiling. "Dad?" She whispered, her voice a dry, jagged ghost of itself. "Why are we... Where is Marcus? He said you were in the ICU. He said I had to take the pills to stay calm. Even now drugged and betrayed, she was trying to find a way to make his lies hold weight." I realized I could not be gentle anymore. The time for soft words had passed when he turned the key on that basement door. I spread the reconstructed Plan E emails across her hospital tray, the paper crinkling under my trembling hands. I laid out the life insurance policy with the double indemnity clause and the photos of Marcus at the casino, his arm around a woman wearing our family's pearls. "He wasn't saving your father, Emily." I watched her scan the words primary beneficiary and brake line sabotage. "He was counting the days until your car hit that hill. He was appraisal you for parts, honey." The hospital records were a white light autopsy of a marriage that had been dead on arrival. I watched her heart break in real time. It wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow, agonizing crumble, the sound of a foundation surrendering to the tide. I gave him everything, Dad. She choked out the first real tears tracking through the hospital grime on her cheeks. I even apologized for being tired. I thought I was the one failing us. I'm a fool. I'm such a fool. The metaphor of her life was shifting the foundational lie finally removed. She clutched the insurance papers so hard they tore her knuckles white and shaking. She told me then that Marcus had visited her at the hospital just yesterday before the sedation, and had her sign a document he claimed was for a medical proxy for Daniel. It was a power of attorney, Dad. He told me it was for the insurance. I realized with a jolt of icy terror that Marcus now had the legal right to pull her out of this hospital against her will. He wasn't just a husband. He was her legal captor. The sliding glass doors of the ER hissed open with a sound like a guillotine. Marcus Redmond stepped through the entryway, his concerned husband mask perfectly adjusted, clutching a bouquet of lilies that looked exactly like funeral flowers. The sweet, sickening scent of the lilies hit me like a physical blow as he spotted us. I met Marcus in the center of the fluorescent-lit hallway, my shadow lengthening across the linoleum like a structural crack he hadn't seen coming until the ceiling began to groan. I heard his voice before I saw him calling out Emily's name in a tone full of fake honeyed concern. He was walking toward the ER bay, clutching a bouquet of white lilies that looked less like a gift and more like a floral arrangement for a wake. The wet vegetal smell of the flowers preceded him, cloying and sweet, filling the sterile corridor with the scent of a funeral home. I stepped out from the bay, blocking his path, my feet planted firmly on the polished tiles. Marcus stopped, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before the mask of the grieving husband was slammed back into place. "Howard, thank God you are here," he said, his voice trembling with practiced emotion. "I got the call from the hospital. How is she? What happened?" I did not answer right away. I let the clinical hum of the overhead lights fill the space between us. I had spent 40 years checking for the points where bridges fail, and right now, Marcus Redmond was a structure under immense pressure, one I was about to collapse with a single calculated strike. "I have legal authority," Howard Marcus snapped when I didn't move. "She is my wife. I have a power of attorney she signed yesterday. Now, get out of my way so I can see her." He tried to brush past me, but I didn't budge. It was a power reversal he hadn't prepared for. I leaned in, my face inches from his, the sharp taste of adrenaline filling my mouth. "You are too late, Marcus. I already spoke with the hospital administrator. Based on the toxicology report, the one showing a massive dose of Daniel's heart medication in her system, they have placed Emily on a medical hold. Based on the toxicology report showing a massive dose of Daniel's heart medication in her system, the hospital has placed Emily on a medical hold. Agent Morrison has also obtained an emergency court order, suspending your power of attorney pending investigation. You no longer have any legal authority over her care." I watched the color drain from his face, the gray pallor of the lights matching his complexion. "She is your payout, Marcus. And I have already sent the invoices and the emails we reconstructed to the FBI. You are not a husband anymore. You are a fugitive who just has not started running yet." The mask didn't just slip. It shattered on the floor along with those funeral lilies. Marcus stood there, his hands empty, his fingers twitching, as if he wanted to reach for my throat. The predatory snarl that replaced his concern was a structural revelation, the raw steel of his malice finally exposed. "You think you are so smart, don't you, old man?" he hissed, his voice dropping into a low register. "You think you can just step in and take what is mine?" I produced a printed screenshot from my pocket, the life insurance policy with the double indemnity clause. I held it up so he could see the numbers, the hard evidence of his appraisal of my daughter's life. "I know about Plan E, Marcus. I know about the brake lines on Cooper Hill. I know about the 7 women who came before her." Marcus physically stumbled back, his boots scuffing against the linoleum. The clinical lights seemed to pulse with the intensity of his rage. I did not wait for him to recover. I raised my hand and signaled to the security guard standing near the nurse's station. "This man drugged my daughter," I said, my voice carrying through the hallway. "He is a danger to the patients in this ward." Seeing the net closing, Marcus did not wait for the guard. He turned on his heel, his expensive shoes clicking a frantic rhythm as he retreated toward the elevators. "This isn't over, old man," he yelled back, his face contorted in homicidal rage. "You don't know who you are messing with." I watched him go, the heavy hospital doors swinging shut. "I know exactly who you are, Marcus," I whispered to the empty air. "You are the failure I am finally removing from the structure. How many times does a man have to threaten your life before you stop treating him like a human being and start treating him like a target?" I felt the hard edge of the hospital's security badge in my pocket, a reminder that for the next few hours I had won the legal battle, but the war was shifting into a new phase. I turned and walked toward the exit, my heart still drumbeating a steady cadence. I had to find Tom. We were no longer just observers. We were the next obstacles to be cleared from Marcus's path. I returned to the surveillance van, parked in the shadows, the air inside smelling of stale coffee. Tom was hunched over the monitors, his face illuminated by the blue flicker. He did not look up when I climbed in. "Howard, listen to this," he said, his voice tight. He hit a key and a recording began to play. It was a burner phone call intercepted from the elevator minutes ago. I heard Marcus's voice sharp and breathless. "Travis, the old man knows. The FBI is a certainty now. We have to pivot. Eliminate the secondary obstacle tonight. I want a heart incident. He is old Travis. A little digitalis in his tea, a fall in the kitchen. Make it look like the stress of his daughter's accident was too much for his heart." The recording hissed with a static that sounded like a snake coiled in the grass of my own home. My breath hitched. The clinical cruelty of the order was a metaphor for his entire existence. Everything was a project to be managed, even murder. I felt a cold chill. The exit twist was a structural blow I had not seen coming. Tom pointed to a secondary monitor, a map showing a blinking red dot. That is Travis Coleman's phone, Howard. He is already parked in your apartment complex in Maplewood. He is waiting for you to go home. My apartment was no longer a sanctuary. It was a kill box. Tom gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. We cannot go back to Maplewood, Howard. Travis is already inside your building. We have to disappear, and we have to do it right now. I looked back at the hospital, where Emily was finally safe behind locked doors and medical holds, and then at the dark road ahead. The sound of the van's engine turning over was a mechanical growl of defiance. The screech of tires as Tom pulls the van out of the parking structure echoed like a scream in the midnight air. The tires of the surveillance van screamed against the wet pavement as we fled the hospital's sterile safety, leaving behind the only life my daughter knew for a midnight highway that felt like a road to nowhere. I sat in the back, my boots braced against the metal floorboards, holding Emily's hand as she drifted in and out of a medicated stupor. The smell of burning rubber and cold rain seeped through the door seals, mixing with the sharp clinical scent of the hospital tape still stuck to her arm. Tom Crawford was hunched over the wheel, his knuckles white in the dim green glow of the dashboard. He was driving with a controlled mechanical aggression that I recognized from our days on the bridge cruise, the kind of focus you need when the structure is failing and every second counts. I looked out the back window watching the city lights dissolve into the pitch-black shadows of the New Jersey state forests. Every pair of headlights that appeared behind us felt like a sniper's scope locking onto my spine. I knew Travis Coleman was out there moving with the same predatory intent Marcus had whispered over the burner phone. I discovered something then that made my stomach turn. Marcus hadn't just stolen Emily's money. He had been using my own identity and social security number to co-sign his offshore gambling debts. If he disappeared or died, the syndicate wouldn't just go after Emily. They would come for my meager pension, the only pittance I had left to support her. We tore through the night, the engine's roar, a constant vibrating reminder of our vulnerability. I kept checking Emily's pulse, my fingers finding the steady thrum in her wrist that Marcus had tried so hard to silence. "Keep her head level," Howard Tom barked over his shoulder. "If those pills haven't fully processed, we need her breathing clear. I'm not letting her go." "Tom," I rasped, my voice sounding like grinding stone. "Not for all the insurance money in the world." A single pair of headlights appeared in the rear view. My heart stopped. I watched them crawl closer, the glare reflecting off the van's polished interior. I gripped my heavy flashlight ready for the impact, but then the light slowed and turned off into a side road. The relief was a physical ache. Tom was on a secure line with Agent Sarah Morrison briefing the FBI on the heart incident threat. The federal net was supposed to be closing, but out here in the dark between the towering pines and the empty asphalt, we were the only law that mattered. Around 2 a.m, we reached a secluded cabin deep in the woods of northern New Jersey, a place where the air was so cold it bit into my lungs. Rick, a 55-year-old former tactical officer with silver-shot hair and a face that seemed perpetually carved from cold Atlantic salt, stood in the doorway of the cabin like a lighthouse guard waiting for a storm. He didn't waste time with greetings. "No phones, no lights, no exceptions." Rick stated, his voice a gravelly command as he chambered around in his shotgun. "If they found you at the hospital, they have a tail or a tracker." I carried Emily's weak, limp body inside the smell of pine needles and damp earth clinging to us. I tucked her into a small bedroom in the back, covering her with a heavy wool blanket that smelled of wood smoke. When I returned to the kitchen, the blackout protocol was already in effect. Rick had covered the windows with heavy canvas, and the only light came from a single flickering kerosene lamp on the table. We sat in the heavy silence of the woods, 3 men who had spent their lives inspecting failures, now waiting for the ultimate collapse. How can a man sleep in the same bed as a woman he's already filed under disposition? The question haunted me as I sat at the table, my eyes drawn to Emily's tote bag in the corner. I reached inside and pulled out Marcus's laptop. She must have grabbed it in her dazed state before we left the house. I used my engineering logic to bypass the simple security password, his own wedding anniversary, a final insult to the sanctity of the bond. I found a hidden partition, a digital vault, where he kept the blueprints of his greed. I unmasked a spreadsheet titled budget_planning.xlsx. The spreadsheet was a blueprint for a slaughterhouse, and my daughter was the next one in the chute. I stared at the names of 7 women, including Emily. There were columns for acquisition cost, insurance value, and a chilling final column labeled disposition. The entry for Emily was listed as work in progress with a payout date of February 15th. "Look at the names above hers," Howard Tom whispered, leaning over my shoulder. "Two of them are marked completed. Those are the ones who didn't survive the accident." My hands shook as I scrolled further down, discovering a monthly consulting fee paid to a local police precinct. The Redmond Ring hadn't just been lucky. They had bought protection from the very people supposed to investigate the accidents. The clicking of the keyboard was the only sound in the absolute silence of the cabin, a rhythmic tapping that felt like a death knell. We had the evidence now, the names, the bank accounts, the proof of the serial murders. It was a triumph of data over deception, but the victory felt hollow in the freezing air of the safe house. Suddenly, Tom's satellite phone chirped with a message from Agent Morrison. The high-pitched digital sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. I watched Tom's face drain of all color as he read the screen. "Warehouse raid failed," he read aloud, his voice hollow. "Suspects fled at 1 a.m. They know about the cabin." I looked at the heavy branch snapping in the woods just outside the kitchen window, the sound sharp and deliberate. We weren't safe. The structure hadn't just cracked, it was coming down on top of us. The blue light of Tom's satellite phone didn't just illuminate his pale face. It cast a sickly glow over the structural collapse of our only remaining sanctuary, proving that the predators hadn't just escaped the net, they were holding the strings. I sat at the small pine table, the wood rough against my palms, watching the transmission details scroll across the screen. Agent Morrison's message was a terminal fracture in our safety. They had hit the warehouse at 1 a.m., but it was a tomb of empty crates and discarded burner phones. Marcus and Travis Coleman were gone, and worse, they had cleared out with a precision that screamed advance warning. "They didn't just run, Tom?" I rasped, my voice sounding like gravel being crushed under a heavy load. "They were escorted out by a warning call. We aren't being hunted by thugs. We're being hunted by the system." Tom nodded, his eyes fixed on the map. It was a breach of intel that made my skin crawl. Rick immediately shifted into a higher tier of blackout protocol. He didn't ask for permission. He simply grabbed a stack of heavy plywood from the porch and began hammering it over the already dark windows. "Rick, get the boards up," I urged, feeling the phantom pressure of eyes from the tree line. "If they know the coordinates, we're sitting ducks in a glass house." The hammer met the wood, a loud, violent crack of a nail being driven home. It sounded too much like a gunshot. Each blow vibrated through the floorboards, a rhythmic reminder that our perimeter was shrinking. I realized then that the GPS tracker Tom had slid across the diner table weeks ago wasn't the failsafe I thought it was. It was a dual signal device, a sophisticated piece of hardware that Travis, the Syndicate's technical logistics expert, had remotely hijacked. He hadn't just been tracking Marcus, he had reversed the polarity using our own surveillance as a homing beacon to lead them straight to this cabin. It was a structural betrayal of the very technology I had relied on to save my daughter. Tom sat hunched over his laptop, monitoring police frequencies and fugitive alerts, but the air in the room felt heavy with the scent of fresh plywood and our own cold sweat. We watched the BOLO alerts for the red Tesla, but I knew better. Men this calculated would have switched vehicles at a prearranged cold site hours ago, vanishing into the gray geography of the Jersey Turnpike. By 8 a.m., the cabin was a dark, airless box. I checked on Emily in the back bedroom. She was awake but fragile, her eyes wide, and tracking the sounds of Rick's heavy boots in the hallway. I had to explain to her that the temporary peace of the cabin had been shattered by the failed raid. "They're coming for the laptop, aren't they?" She asked, her voice a dry, papery whisper that broke my heart. She clutched the heavy wool blanket to her chest, as if it could stop a bullet. "They're coming for their completed column, honey," I told her, my hand steadying her shoulders. "But they have to get through me first." I felt a surge of protective fury that felt as old as the mountains surrounding us. How do you defend a perimeter when the enemy is already inside, the thoughts you haven't even spoken yet? I left her with a glass of water and returned to the kitchen, where Tom was sifting through the encrypted noise of the web. The low, persistent hum of his hardware was the only sound in the suffocating silence. We were waiting for the next crack in the structure, the moment when the pressure would finally force a collapse. The group spent a restless morning in the total silence, jumping at every snap of a dry branch in the surrounding woods. Around 3 p.m., the bitter taste of cold, dreg-filled coffee was the only thing keeping me upright. Tom's phone suddenly vibrated on the laminate counter, a sharp buzzing intrusion that made me reach for my heavy engineering flashlight. It was a notification from an unknown encrypted source. I looked over his shoulder as he opened the message. There was no text at first, only a high-resolution grainy photograph. The tree line wasn't a forest anymore. It was a wall of dark, unblinking eyes waiting for the sun to drop. The photo showed me. It was a live shot of me, standing by the small kitchen window, taken from the tree line, only minutes before Rick had finished boarding it up. My chest tightened against my ribs, a rhythmic, heavy thumping that drowned out the hum of the laptop. "Tom, look at the timestamp," I whispered, pointing at the digital clock on the screen. "That's me, 5 minutes ago. They're in the woods. They aren't coming. They're already here." The realization of our total physical vulnerability was an absolute peak of suspense. I could feel the frigid, damp air seep through the gaps in the boards, smelling of winter ozone and impending violence. Then, a second notification pinged. It was the plan reveal, a text message that stripped away the last of Marcus's humanity. "Give us the laptop, and the girl, and the old man gets a clean heart attack instead of a messy one." It was a bargain made in hell, a final appraisal of my life against the data we held. The metaphor of the bridge was gone. We were just flesh and bone in a wooden cage. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white, staring at the phone like it was a venomous snake. A heavy thud suddenly vibrated through the floorboards, not from the wind or a falling branch, but from the distinct, undeniable weight of a boot landing on the porch right outside the kitchen door. The structure groaned, the wood of the porch yielding to the predator's weight. I looked at Tom, then at Rick, who was already raising his shotgun toward the door handle. The lock rattled, a frantic, rhythmic clicking that signaled the end of our hiding and the beginning of the siege. The wood of the kitchen door didn't just rattle. It groaned under the weight of a shoulder that knew exactly how to find the weakest point in a structure's defense. I stood in the center of the dark cabin, my fingers white-knuckled around the handle of an old aluminum baseball bat. The sound of the kitchen door handle rattling as someone tried the lock sent a vibration through the floorboards that I felt in the very marrow of my bones. Rick didn't hesitate. He gestured toward the narrow hallway with a sharp downward motion of his shotgun. "Bathroom?" Now he roared, his voice a low-frequency rumble that cut through the mounting panic. I grabbed Emily by the elbow, her skin cold and clammy beneath her sweater. She was still half lost in the sedative fog, her eyes tracking the shadows with a terrified, uncomprehending sluggishness. I led her into the windowless bathroom and hoisted her into the cast-iron bathtub, just as Rick had ordered. "Guard her with your life, Howard," he barked, moving back toward the kitchen. I realized then that my 40 years of studying structural integrity had narrowed down to this defending 1 square inch of timber between my daughter and a predator. Crack. The door frame didn't just break, it screamed. It was the sound of heavy timber braces, Rick's prior reinforcements, fighting against the brute force of a shoulder. I discovered a horrifying detail. Through the thin walls, Marcus wasn't the one at the door. I heard him arguing with someone outside, his voice sharp and high-pitched with desperation. It was Travis Coleman, 38, who burst through the fractured wood like a parasite entering a fresh host. His slick designer suit now stained with the mud of the forest he had used to track us. Travis was the one doing the heavy lifting, and I realized Marcus was merely the vessel used to pay off Travis's own syndicate debts. I knelt beside the tub. The cold porcelain texture of the bathtub bit into my knees. I wrapped my arm around Emily, pulling her head to my chest. "Don't listen, Emily," I whispered, my voice thick with a primal protectiveness. "Just listen to my voice. I'm right here. I'm not leaving you." Outside the bathroom door, the cabin had become a theater of violence. Glass shattered in the living room as a rock was hurled through the plywood, letting the freezing winter air rush into our small sanctuary. The blinding white light of the snow outside the shattered window reflected off the hallway walls, casting distorted, jumping shadows. Marcus began shouting from the woods, his voice amplified by the trees sounding hollow and monstrous. "Give me the laptop and the nurse, Howard," he screamed. "I'll make sure your heart gives out quickly." "It's over, old man. You're just a disposition on a ledger." The clinical hatred in his voice was a structural revelation. He didn't see a family. He saw an inventory. How much of a man is left when he has to hide behind a cast-iron tub to keep his child from becoming a statistic? I felt the ancient weight of the bat in my hands, a low-tech answer to a high-stakes betrayal. The sound of a heavy industrial sledgehammer struck the rear door with a rhythmic, bone-shaking thud. Rick fired a warning shot through the wood, the smell of gunpowder and winter ozone instantly filling the hallway. The blast was deafening in the confined space, leaving a high-pitched ringing in my ears. But there was return fire from the tree line, a sharp pop, pop, pop that forced Rick to dive for cover. I heard the back door finally give way, the timber splintering with a sound like a small explosion. Multiple sets of heavy boots entered the living room, their weight vibrating through the floorboards. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a sinking ship, and the ocean was made of hungry, desperate men. I locked the bathroom door, my breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. The air in the small room felt thick, claustrophobic, and charged with the metallic scent of adrenaline. I watched the door handle, waiting for the moment the structural failure would reach the final room in the house. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a countdown. Then above the chaos of the breaking wood and the shouting, I heard a new sound. It was a rhythmic, distant beat, a low-frequency thrum that grew louder with every second. It was the distinct pulse of a low-flying helicopter. The exit twist hit me with a surge of hope. The mole in the precinct wasn't as powerful as the FBI's backup units. Agent Morrison hadn't abandoned us, but the rescue was miles of air away, and the threat was only inches of wood. The bathroom door handle turned once, twice, and then a heavy boot slammed against the wood. The lock groaned, the screws stripping from the soft pine. I stood up, stepping in front of the tub, the bat raised over my shoulder. My vision narrowed until all I could see was the point where the door met the frame. I wasn't an old man anymore. I wasn't an inspector. I was the last remaining support of the Palmer name. A second kick sent a shower of white-painted splinters into the room. The door bowed inward, the wood screaming under the tension. I could smell the sweat and the expensive cloying cologne of the man on the other side. The floorboards under my feet felt solid, the foundation of my resolve finally set in stone. I took a deep breath, the cold air from the hallway stinging my lungs, and prepared for the explosion of the bathroom door as the lock finally gave way. I knew what was coming, and for the first time since the gallery, I wasn't afraid of the collapse. I was ready to meet it. The bathroom door didn't just open. It exploded inward in a shower of white-painted splinters. But the roar that followed wasn't from Marcus Redmond. It was the thunder of justice arriving in a flash bang of blinding light. I threw myself over Emily, shielding her body with mine, as the blinding white-hot glare of a flashbang detonated in the living room, turning the world into a searing void of noise and light. The cabin roof seemed to vibrate with the arrival of the FBI tactical unit, their boots thundering across the porch like the hammer of God. Through the fractured bathroom door, I saw figures in tactical gear moving with the grace of high-tensile steel cables. Travis Coleman had been reaching for the bathtub, his face a snarl of desperation. But he was swept off his feet before his fingers could touch the porcelain. Flashbangs continued to echo the smell of burnt gunpowder and old wood filling the air. Marcus Redmond was pinned to the floor, his face pressed into the dusty floorboards. The concerned husband mask was gone, replaced by animalistic screaming about his rights and legal representation. In the corner, Daniel Redmond sat, huddled sobbing, with a mix of terror and profound relief that the nightmare had finally reached its structural limit. As the FBI agents prepared to transport the prisoners, an officer helped Daniel to his feet. The old man's legs trembled, barely able to support his weight. As he was guided past me toward the door, Daniel stopped. His watery eyes met mine, and for a moment, the hardened shell of the co-conspirator cracked completely. "Ah, Howard!" He whispered, his voice barely audible over the radio chatter. "I'm so sorry. He said he'd hurt my granddaughter Julia. She's only 8, my daughter's child from my first marriage. He said if I didn't help, they'd find her." His hand reached out trembling, as if seeking absolution I wasn't sure I could give. "I was weak. I should have come to you. I should have protected Emily instead of—" His voice broke. Before I could respond, Marcus's voice exploded from where he lay pinned. "Shut your mouth, old man. Don't you dare say another—" An agent pressed Marcus's face harder into the floor, cutting off the tirade. I looked back at Daniel and saw not a criminal mastermind, but a broken man who had been weaponized by his own son. The agent gently pulled Daniel toward the door. As he disappeared into the cold January air, I understood the Redmond family had 2 victims, not one villain and one accomplice. Marcus had destroyed them both. I discovered a final jagged truth. As the agents moved in, Travis Coleman had actually taken out a life insurance policy on Marcus as well, intending to kill his partner and frame my heart incident on him once the job was done. The betrayal was circular, a snake eating its own tail. "It is over, Marcus," I whispered, though my voice was drowned out by the metallic heavy weight of handcuffs clicking shut. "The structural integrity of your lie just hit 0. Silence. Then the sirens. The most beautiful sound I've ever heard. Agent Sarah Morrison, 44, stepped into the cabin with the crisp, no-nonsense authority of a woman who had spent half her life untangling the webs of men who thought they were smarter than the law. She looked at me, then at Emily, and gave a single firm nod. "We've got them, Mr. Palmer. We've got all of them." Weeks later, the violence of that afternoon had faded into the dry, rough texture of the auditor's paper reports. I sat with Emily and a federal auditor in a quiet office, the walls lined with the cold weight of legal binders. We began the somber process of the financial autopsy. They discovered that while the FBI recovered some assets from Marcus's luxury rentals, the total theft from Emily stood at $47,000. $15,000 was already laundered through offshore gambling sites, vanishing into the digital ether. Emily leaned forward, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers. Travis didn't just steal the cash. He had used her social security number to open 15 different credit lines. He had been murdering her financial future before her car ever reached the hill. How do you put a price on the moment you realize your name has been sold to strangers in the dark? $15,000 is gone, Emily, I said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. But we can rebuild the credit. It is just paper. You are still standing. She looked at me, her eyes hollow. He didn't just want me dead, Dad. He wanted me erased. He wanted to leave a ghost behind so he could inherit $1 million from a woman who never truly existed to him. The auditor cleared her throat, flipping to a final disturbing page in the file. She revealed that Marcus had been recording Emily's therapy sessions for months before the sedation. He was looking for signs of suicidal ideation to bolster his accidental death claim, hoping to paint a picture of a depressed nurse who simply lost control of her vehicle. The cold calculation of it made my blood run cold. Her credit score was a burned-out husk, but the woman inside was still breathing, and that was a victory Marcus hadn't factored into his blueprints. By March, the Princeton home was a memory part of a civil seizure that would likely take years to untangle. Emily moved back into my small apartment in Maplewood. I moved my bed into the living room, arranging the furniture so she could have the privacy of the bedroom. I spent my evenings back at the scarred kitchen table counting pennies again. Not for art this time, but for the therapy sessions Emily needed to process the deep structural rot of Marcus's betrayal. The rhythmic, comforting sound of my old clock in the apartment filled the silence, a steady pylon of normalcy. I watched her sleep from the doorway, sometimes realizing that, while we were broken, the central pillar of our family, my love for her was the only thing that didn't snap under the pressure. "I'm sorry you were on the couch, Dad," she whispered one night, coming out for a glass of water. I looked at her, seeing the strength returning to her gaze. "I've spent my life checking bridges, honey. I know a solid foundation when I see one. This apartment is the safest place on earth right now." I sat back down and began tucking the auditor's report into my filing cabinet. The paper felt heavy, a physical record of a war survived. As I slid the folder into place, a small handwritten envelope fell out of the back of Emily's confiscated purse. An envelope the FBI had returned only that morning. It was addressed to her in a firm, steady hand, from a man she had never mentioned in all our long talks. The soft rustle of paper as I retrieved it felt like the first tremor of a new bridge being built. I stared at the name on the return address, David Miller. The mystery of her secret life was far from over, but the walls of our sanctuary felt thicker than they ever had before. I looked at the envelope, then at the closed bedroom door, and realized that even the most thorough inspection can miss a hidden chamber. I took a deep breath, the air in the apartment finally clear of the scent of lilies and gunpowder, and prepared myself for whatever the next blueprints held. The paper was a soft, cream linen, the kind that usually carries wedding invitations or condolences, but it felt like a live wire in my hand, as I realized my daughter had been harboring a secret of her own while Marcus was busy planning her funeral. I sat at my small kitchen table, the light of a July afternoon, filtering through the thin curtains, and smoothed the mysterious envelope. I had spent months thinking I was the only pylon holding up the bridge of Emily's life, only to find this evidence of a hidden chamber. When I finally confronted her, I expected to find another predator lurking in the shadows. Instead, Emily's face softened, a genuine sad clarity washing over her features. She told me the name David Miller. He wasn't a lover or a creditor. David Miller, 34, sat on the park bench when we met him a few days later, with the rigid, upright posture of an architect who spent his life ensuring foundations didn't shift. His eyes carrying a weary fire I recognized as my own. He was the brother of Sarah Miller, Marcus's second wife, who had died in that suspicious 2019 rollover. David had been a ghost in Marcus's periphery for years, tracking the patterns of the man who had destroyed his family. He had reached out to Emily months ago, but Marcus's gaslighting had been a structural barrier too thick to penetrate at the time. Now David was no longer a voice in an envelope. He was a brother in arms. "I'm not here for money, Mr. Palmer." David said, his voice as steady as a plumb line. "I'm here because my sister's stress tolerance for pain was reached 3 years ago, and I won't let her memory be a footnote in Marcus's bank account." I looked at him and felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. "You have the evidence he thought he destroyed, don't you?" I asked. David nodded, opening a leather portfolio. I discovered then that David Miller is a forensic architect. He didn't just have suspicions, he had the professional credentials to testify about the structural impossibility of the 2019 car crash being an accident. He had mapped the kinetic energy and the angle of the impact, proving the vehicle had been tampered with before it ever left the driveway. Have you ever found a hand reaching out from the dark and realized it wasn't a ghost, but a brother in arms? The alliance was forged there in the quiet shade of Maplewood Park, under the watchful eyes of the trees. We spent the next several months in a grueling marathon of trial preparation. The apartment became a war room, cluttered with depositions, bank statements, and blueprints of failed machinery. Emily attended intensive trauma therapy twice a week, her spirit slowly rebuilding its own internal supports, while I meticulously organized the physical evidence into a trial-ready format. We worked closely with prosecutor Michael Preston, ensuring that every structural failure in Marcus's story was backed by irrefutable concrete data. "We don't just want him in prison," Michael, I told the prosecutor during one of our late-night sessions. "We want the world to see the blueprint of how he breaks families. We want the autopsy of a monster." By the time December arrived, the air in the city was sharp and cold, matching the mood of the legal team. On Monday, May 19th, 2026, the day of the trial finally dawned, a gray, oppressive morning that felt heavy with the scent of old paper and wood polish. I stood in the hallway of the federal courthouse, adjusting my tie with fingers that were surprisingly steady. I was the first witness the opening salvo in a war that had started with $82 and a coastal painting. The heavy rhythmic thud of the judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, a sound like a pile driver hitting a bedrock footing. I took the stand, the harsh artificial glare of the courtroom lights reflecting off the polished mahogany. I took a sip of the water in the glass beside me, the taste dry and chalky against my tongue. He sat there, right there, 5 feet away, and he smiled at me. Marcus Redmond didn't look like a prisoner. He looked like a man who believed his own lies could still outrun the truth. He wore a sharp suit, his posture arrogant, projecting a terrifying confidence that he could still gaslight the jury, just as he had gaslit my daughter. I began my testimony recounting the pivotal moment at Green's Fine Art Gallery. I described the smell of turpentine and the way the $82 had felt in my hand. I told the jury about the transformation I had witnessed the Armani-clad spender in the gallery versus the t-shirt-wearing pauper in Princeton. I watched him buy a $3,000 painting with cash he stole from a woman who couldn't afford new shoes. For her 12-hour nursing shifts, I said, my voice ringing out with a righteous indignation that made the room fall into a heavy silence. The courtroom felt like a bridge under a stress test, and I could hear the bolts beginning to snap. I didn't look at the jury. I looked at Marcus. I watched the smirk flicker on his face, a tiny fracture in his foundation. But then his defense attorney stood up, a shark in a pinstripe suit. He produced a document that felt like a physical blow to my chest, a signed letter allegedly written by my late wife before her death. The lawyer claimed it disparaged my mental health, attempting to frame the entire investigation as the delusions of a senile old man. It was a betrayal from beyond the grave, a lie engineered to collapse the entire structure of our case before it could even begin. I felt the room tilt, the metaphor of the failing bridge becoming all too real. But then I remembered the data. I remembered the invoices, the intercepted calls, and the manila folder David Miller had brought from the shadows. I looked directly into Marcus's cold, calculating eyes and reached into my pocket. I pulled out the small coastal painting I had bought for $52, the very first crack in his empire. I held it up for the jury to see, the modest blue of the ocean, a stark contrast to the greed in the room. This wasn't a delusion, I thought, my resolve hardening into steel. This was an inspection, and the inspector was finally ready to sign off on the demolition. The defense attorney didn't just walk toward the witness stand. He circled it like a shark sensing a leak in the hull. But I knew my daughter wasn't the prey anymore. She was the iceberg that would finally sink him. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my back straight, watching the man who had tried to discredit me with a forged letter from my late wife. It was a pathetic attempt at structural sabotage. During the cross-examination, I had calmly pointed out that the ink used in that letter wasn't even manufactured until 3 years after her death, a detail I knew because of my professional history with chemical finishes and material forensics. The attorney had stammered his foundation crumbling before the jury's eyes. Now it was Emily's turn to provide the load-bearing testimony. She took the stand with a clinical, steady voice that made me swell with a painful sort of pride. She was no longer the exhausted nurse I had rescued from a Princeton basement. She was a witness to her own attempted execution. Emily described the vitamins Marcus had forced upon her with a terrifying clarity. She spoke about the cold realization that her entire marriage had been a long-term project aimed at her disposition. She didn't just offer emotional pleas, she produced her oncology nursing logs, cross-referencing her periods of extreme exhaustion with the exact timestamps Marcus was using her identity to transfer funds into his gambling shell accounts. I spent my life fighting for children's survival, while the man I loved was calculating the insurance value of my death, she said, her voice echoing in the dry, stale air of the courtroom. Your Honor, he didn't just sedate me, he tried to erase me. I watched Marcus at the defense table. His smirk didn't waver at first, but I could see the twitch in his jaw, the subtle vibration of a structure reaching its yield point. He didn't blink. Not once. Even as the foreman read the word guilty for the 7th time during the later victim testimony, his eyes remained fixed on her with a predatory stillness that made my blood run cold. The prosecution didn't stop with Emily. Over the next week, they called the families of the other 6 victims. David Miller took the stand, his posture rigid and his testimony absolute. As a forensic architect, he provided the engineering proof that his sister's car's brake lines had been cut, with the same surgical precision described in the Plan E emails we had reconstructed. He showed diagrams of the kinetic failure, proving the collapse was intentional. The courtroom air turned frigid as the cumulative weight of Marcus's history was laid bare. How many lives do you have to steal before you forget the sound of your own real name? I wondered watching Marcus. The jury sat in a silence so heavy it felt physical, absorbing the litany of losses that had funded a red Tesla and an Armani lifestyle. By the time the families finished speaking, the defense was nothing more than a pile of splinters. Marcus's confidence was finally beginning to look like what it actually was, a hollow shell. After 36 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The high-pitched ringing in my ears was so loud, it drowned out the hum of the air conditioning. I gripped Emily's hand, her fingers cold but steady. The foreman stood up and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, attempted murder, and grand larceny. The gavel fell like a demolition ball, finally leveling the house of cards Marcus had built. The judge didn't hold back, her voice ringing with a fierce moral authority. Marcus Redmond, you are a predator who used the sanctity of marriage as a killing field. You will never see the light of day again. She sentenced him to life without parole. When it came time for Daniel Redmond's sentencing, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Daniel had sat through the entire trial in near complete silence, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the floor. He never looked at Marcus. He never looked at Emily or me. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, his public defender stood and whispered urgently in his ear, likely advising silence. But Daniel slowly shook his head. He rose to his feet, his movement stiff and aged beyond his 62 years, and faced the judge directly. Your Honor. He began, his voice a thin, papery rasp that barely carried past the first row. I plead guilty to all charges. I don't ask for mercy. I don't deserve it. He paused, swallowing hard. 5 years ago, my son discovered I had gambling debts, $200,000, to people who don't forgive debt. Marcus told me he had a way to solve it, but I needed to help him. When I refused, he showed me photos of my granddaughter, Julia, 8 years old, my daughter's child from my first marriage, who lives 2 states away. He said if I didn't cooperate, he would make sure his business partners knew where to find her. Daniel's voice cracked, and he gripped the edge of the defendant's table to steady himself. I was a coward. I watched my son destroy 7 families, including Emily Palmer's, and I said nothing. I played the dying man. I provided pills to sedate her. I stood by while he planned her death. He turned slightly, finally meeting my eyes across the courtroom. Mr. Palmer, I should have come to you the day I realized what Marcus was planning. Instead, I chose my granddaughter's safety over your daughter's life. That makes me guilty of everything the prosecution has charged. I will carry that shame to my grave. The courtroom was silent. Even Marcus, seated at the defense table, had stopped his usual smirking. The judge studied Daniel for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Redmond, your coercion does not absolve you. You enabled a monster. You facilitated the harm of innocent women. However, the court acknowledges the duress you faced. You are sentenced to 40 years. You will serve your time." As the bailiffs led him away in shackles, Daniel looked back at me one final time, not with defiance, but with the hollow eyes of a man who had already served a life sentence in his own conscience. The judge turned her attention to the remaining defendants. "Travis Coleman, you coordinated the logistics of 7 attempted murders, provided detailed instructions for vehicular sabotage, and orchestrated cleanup operations to obstruct justice. Your technical expertise was the engine of this conspiracy. You are sentenced to 15 years in federal prison." Travis's face remained blank, showing no remorse even as the bailiffs moved toward him. "Lydia Vance?" The judge continued, her voice hardening. "As a senior insurance adjuster, you violated your professional oath and the public trust. You fast-tracked fraudulent policies, bypassed mandatory medical evaluations, and facilitated a scheme that treated human lives as line items on a balance sheet. You are sentenced to 18 years for wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice." Lydia's composure finally cracked. She wept as the bailiffs approached, but the courtroom remained silent, unmoved by tears that came far too late for the families she had helped destroy. Marcus, watching from his seat, finally lost his composure. The metallic clink of Marcus's shackles, as he was forced to stand, was a symphony of justice. As Marcus was being led out by the bailiffs, the final structural collapse occurred. He twisted in his restraints, his face contorting into a mask of pure animalistic rage. He didn't look at Emily or me. He screamed at his own father. "It was your idea!" Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking. "You picked her. You said the lonely father had the best insurance benefits." Daniel didn't look up, but the betrayal was a jagged, ugly thing that hung in the air long after they were gone. The exit twist was a bitter reminder that the rot in the Redmond family went all the way to the bedrock. I stood up, my knees creaking, and led Emily toward the exit. The smell of damp wool coats and lingering anxiety followed us out into the hallway. But for the first time in over a year, I felt the tension in my own shoulders begin to ease. The bridge was finally clear of the wreckage. I walked Emily out of the courthouse into the freezing January air, feeling the first real breath of peace since this nightmare began. The sky was a pale winter blue, mirroring the color of the coastal painting that had started it all. We were heading toward the parking lot when a prison courier in a gray uniform tapped me on the shoulder. He didn't say a word, just handed me a thick yellow envelope. I felt the rough manila texture in my hand, the weight of it unexpected and heavy. I looked at the return address and felt my heart skip a beat. It was from Travis Coleman, sent from the county processing center. The sound of the courier's footsteps retreating was the only noise in the quiet afternoon as I stared at the envelope. I knew the war should have been over, but the thickness of the paper suggested there was a final blueprint I hadn't seen. I looked at Emily, who was watching me with a mixture of confusion and renewed fear, and I realized that the inspector's job is never truly finished until the last bolt is accounted for. I gripped the thick manila envelope as the prison courier's shadow vanished into the gray January mist, its weight far heavier than mere paper. Like a loose bolt finally falling out of a machine we thought we'd already turned off. I stood frozen on the courthouse steps, the rough fiber-rich texture of the manila envelope scratching against my palm. The victory inside the courtroom should have been enough. Marcus Redmond was in chains and Daniel was headed for a cell, but the heavy weight in my hand told me the inspection wasn't over. I tucked the envelope deep into my coat pocket and walked toward the cafe where Emily and David Miller were waiting. We gathered in the quiet, frost-covered garden, behind their favorite spot, the air smelling of cold winter jasmine. I watched as David, a man of quiet integrity and structural strength, took Emily's hand. He spoke with the rigid honesty of a man who spent his life ensuring foundations didn't shift. "I want to build something that won't fall, Emily," he said, his voice steady. "Something with a foundation you never have to double-check." I felt a rare, genuine warmth in my chest as I gave them my blessing. "I have spent my life inspecting bridges, David," I told him. "I know a solid pylon when I see one. You have my blessing." But even as we toasted with coffee, the envelope felt like a live wire against my thigh, a reminder of a secret chamber I hadn't yet entered. I returned to my apartment as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple. The rhythmic, muffled sound of distant traffic was the only companion to the silence of my home. I sat at my scarred kitchen table and finally tore open Travis Coleman's letter. It was a jagged, desperate confession. Travis revealed he was talking because Marcus had tried to have him silenced permanently in custody. The words on the page shifted my understanding of the entire case. He named a fifth partner, the true architect behind the legal armor and the fast-tracked insurance policies. Vanessa Grayson. The name hit me with the force of a structural collapse. She was a high-powered corporate lawyer who had erased the digital breadcrumbs of the previous 7 victims. Marcus was just the hammer, Howard the letter read. Vanessa Grayson was the architect. She is still out there sitting in a mahogany office while we rot. I discovered through Travis's rambling prose that Daniel Redmond hadn't even chosen Emily. Vanessa Grayson had. She picked my daughter because Emily's hospital used a legal firm Grayson partially owned. It was a closed loop of predatory engineering. Can a structure truly be safe if the person who designed the safety inspections is the one trying to pull it down? I turned to my computer, the high-pitched digital beep of the startup sequence sounding like a warning siren. I spent hours digging through the public profile of Vanessa Grayson. She was 42 and appeared in her firm's profile with the terrifyingly perfect symmetry of a high-tension suspension bridge, elegant, unyielding, and capable of bearing immense weight without ever showing a single crack. To the world, she was a pillar of the legal community with zero criminal record. To me, she was the secondary obstacle coordinator who ensured all previous accidents were ruled as non-criminal by local coroners who owed her favors. The name Grayson wasn't just on the letter, it was on the building where Emily had her first nursing interview. The rot wasn't just in the family I'd let Emily join, it was in the very soil of the city. I realized that unless she was stopped, the structure of the marriage fraud ring would simply grow a new head. Marcus and Travis were just replaceable parts in a machine she owned. I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey, but the bitter, earthy taste of the cold tea did nothing to settle my stomach. I began to cross-reference the Plan E emails again, using a forensic filter I had developed during my years on the bridge cruise. That is when I found it a digital signature that even Tom had missed. It was an encrypted code embedded in the metadata that matched Vanessa Grayson's private legal server. Vanessa Grayson was the silent conductor, orchestrating every move, ensuring the lie never collapsed too soon. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was the ghost in the machine, the one who dictated the disposition of human beings as if they were nothing more than depreciating assets. I felt a surge of analytical fury. I had spent 40 years looking for the points where steel fails, and now I had found the ultimate stress point in the conspiracy. The blueprints were finally complete, and for the first time, I could see the entire scope of the demolition I had to oversee. I was no longer an old man protecting his daughter. I was the inspector signing off on the removal of a condemned structure. I reached for my phone to call Agent Morrison, intending to hand over the Grayson link and the prison letter. My fingers hovered over the screen, the blue light washing over my tired face. I had the data, the motive, and the digital signature. The bridge of their lies was ready to be pulled down. But before I could dial, the screen lit up with an incoming call from a restricted number. I answered the silence on the other end, heavy and expectant. A voice I didn't recognize, cool, feminine, and utterly devoid of empathy, spoke with a chilling familiarity. "It's a lovely evening for tea, isn't it, Mr. Palmer?" she asked. "Though I imagine the Earl Grey has gone a bit cold. You are sitting at the kitchen table, third chair from the left, aren't you?" My breath hitched in my throat as the realization hit me. My small apartment was no longer a fortress. It was a fishbowl. She wasn't just watching the case, she was watching me. I looked at the window, the darkness of the city reflecting my own stunned expression, and realized the final showdown had already begun. I stared at the cooling Earl Grey, the steam rising like a ghostly warning, while the voice of a million-dollar lawyer whispered through the speaker that she had already calculated the exact force required to snap the remaining cables of my life. The chilling realization that my small apartment was no longer a fortress, but a fishbowl settled over me with a weight that would have crushed a younger man. But I was not a younger man. I was an inspector who had seen hundreds of structures fail, and I knew that the person watching me was just as vulnerable to the laws of physics as the bridge she was trying to burn. Vanessa Grayson's voice was cool, a precision instrument of intimidation. She offered me a retirement bonus, a sum that would have made my pension look like pocket change in exchange for the encrypted audio key I had extracted from Marcus's server. "You are an old man playing with high-tension wires. Howard," she purred, the sound carrying a lethal edge. "One slip and you are the one with the heart incident." I didn't let my hand shake as I reached for the cup. I have spent 40 years inspecting failures. Vanessa, I replied, my voice as flat as a level plane. I know exactly how much pressure a lie can take before it collapses. You see, when a lawyer thinks they are the architect, they forget that some of us spend our lives actually holding the measuring tape. I kept her talking, baiting her with technical questions about the audio key while I initiated a remote uplink to Agent Morrison's secure server. Vanessa's arrogance was her primary structural flaw. She implicitly admitted to managing the disposals of the previous 7 victims, her hubris blinding her to the fact that I never actually had the physical audio key in my apartment. I had presented the digital file to the FBI hours earlier, and this call was merely a honeypot designed to record her attempt at bribery and her admission of coordination. I watched the progress bar on my laptop screen crawl toward 100% each second, a victory of engineering over greed. By the time she realized I was stalling, the uplink was complete. I hung up without a goodbye, the bitter, earthy taste of the cold tea finally matching the mood of the room. The trap was set, and the architect had just walked right into the center of the demolition zone. 10 days later, I watched from a parked car across the street as the FBI executed a coordinated arrest at Grayson & Associates. The high-stakes board meeting was in full swing when Agent Sarah Morrison led her team through the glass doors of the corporate headquarters. I saw Vanessa through the panoramic windows of the top floor, the high-tension symmetry of her life shattered in an instant. The encrypted audio I provided containing her direct instructions to Marcus regarding Emily's disposition was the final girder that held up the grand jury's indictment. The handcuffs clicked. A small sound. A final sound. It was a rhythmic punctuation to a career built on the wreckage of others. As she was led away, her elegant composure was replaced by the frantic, searching look of someone who had just realized the ground beneath her was hollow. Build the case strong. Sarah, I told the agent later that afternoon, I do not want any cracks in her sentencing. I want the world to see the blueprint of how she tried to dismantle my family. On October 18, 2026, I stood in a small garden ceremony watching Emily marry David Miller. 20 guests witnessed the simple, honest exchange of vows, a stark contrast to the theatrical fraud of her first marriage. I cried openly as they sealed their promise with a kiss, finally believing that the bridge of her life had been rebuilt on solid bedrock. With the ring decapitated, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Over the following months, Emily and David bought a modest house in Maplewood and invited me to live with them. We renovated the garage into a small studio apartment, for me a sturdy place with a foundation that went all the way to the bedrock. I spend my days now in the workshop, the scent of fresh cedar sawdust, replacing the lingering smell of hospital antiseptic and lies. I tinker with vintage radios, the rhythmic comforting scrape of a metal file against steel, providing the soundtrack to my retirement. I also volunteer at a legal aid clinic, using my technical eye to help elderly abuse victims recognize the microscopic fractures in their own lives before catastrophic failure occurs. One quiet afternoon in my workshop, Emily and David came by with news that changed the very chemistry of my heart. I walked to the corner of the workshop where I keep my late wife's photo. I whispered to her that our daughter was finally safe, that the bridge we had built together had held firm against the storm. The workshop was quiet, the smell of sawdust and old oil replacing the ghosts of the past. I discovered one final detail during the move, a secondary secret trust my wife had set up for Emily years ago. Marcus had never found it. Even with the financial loss he had caused, Emily's long-term future had always been structurally sound. My wife had been an inspector in her own right, ensuring the load-bearing pillars of our daughter's life were reinforced from the start. I felt a profound sense of closure. The last bolt of the project finally tightened. I picked up a weathered piece of steel and began to polish it, watching my reflection in the metal, no longer a victim of time or greed, but a builder who had finally fixed the most important bridge of all. The warm golden light of the late afternoon sun filled the room, and I picked up my tools to start a new project. The foundation was solid. That is all a father can ever ask for. As I sit here in my small workshop, the smell of cedar sawdust finally replacing the scent of betrayal, I realize the cost of my early silence. I nearly let my daughter become a statistic because I assumed the foundation of her marriage was sound. Don't be like me. Don't wait for the bridge to creak before you check the bolts. This family revenge story is a testament to the fact that vigilance is the highest form of love. I believe God placed me in that gallery that day to be the pylon that held firm when the world tried to pull my daughter down. Looking back at the grandpa stories I've shared, I now understand that a man's true legacy isn't what he builds, but what he protects. Marcus saw people as assets to be liquidated, but I know that some structures are sacred. Every family revenge story needs an inspector who isn't afraid to look into the dark. My personal conviction is that evil only succeeds when we refuse to believe it exists in our own living rooms. These grandpa stories aren't just for entertainment. They are blueprints for survival. If you feel a tremor in your own life, don't ignore it. Inspect the heart of the matter before the collapse. This family revenge story ends with justice, but many grandpa stories don't have such a steady ending. Stay watchful. Thank you for walking this difficult path with me until the final word. Please share your thoughts in the comments. How would you have reacted if you discovered a predator living within your own home? I truly value your unique perspective. If this account resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our future journeys. Just a brief note, while inspired by complex social betrayals, certain elements have been dramatized to heighten the narrative impact. If this specific style isn't to your taste, feel free to explore our other content that might better suit your preferences.